How does one man, born on the far side of the world in a country still finding its place among nations, manage to reshape the information landscape of 3 continents? What decisions, made decades ago in boardrooms and printing houses, would eventually ripple outward to influence elections, topple governments, and divide families across billions of dollars and countless media empires? This is the story of Rupert Murdoch, a figure whose name has become almost synonymous with power, with influence, and with a certain kind of ruthlessness in the pursuit of control over what the world reads, watches, and believes. But before Rupert Murdoch became the titan of media, before the scandals and the power plays, before the succession struggles that would eventually threaten to tear apart everything he built, there was a young man with an inheritance, a newspaper, and an appetite for expansion that seemed almost bottomless. The Murdoch empire didn't spring fully formed from the mind of a visionary genius. It emerged, instead, from a series of calculated moves, opportunistic purchases, strategic alliances, and moments where timing, circumstance, and the sheer force of one man's will seemed to converge in ways that changed history. And yet, paradoxically, this vast architecture of influence, built over decades with such precision and such intention, would eventually begin to crumble not from external pressure, but from the very structure of its own ambitions, and from the complicated question of who, if anyone, could ever truly be trusted to inherit it. If you find yourself drawn to the intricate mechanics of how power really operates in the modern world, how one person's decisions in the shadows of corporate boardrooms can shape what millions of people think they know about reality itself, then subscribe, because we're going to follow this story from its quiet Australian beginnings all the way to the moment when everything began to unravel. Let's begin at the beginning, in a place and time that feels almost impossibly distant now. It is 1931, and a child is born in Melbourne, Australia. His father, Keith Murdoch, is a figure of some consequence, a newspaper magnate in his own right, a man who had clawed his way upward through journalism and business acumen, and who had established a modest but respectable publishing empire across Australia. When young Rupert Murdoch entered the world, he inherited not just a name, but a legacy, a set of connections, and a sense that the newspaper business was not simply a way to make money. It was a way to exercise influence over the narrative of nations. Keith Murdoch was a man shaped by an earlier era of journalism. He understood newspapers not primarily as commercial enterprises designed to maximize profit, though they were certainly that. He understood them as repositories of power, as instruments through which a man with the right instincts and the right ruthlessness could shape public opinion, could make and break politicians, could determine which stories were told, and more importantly, which stories were never told at all. This philosophy, this almost aristocratic conception of the newspaper proprietor as a kind of shadow ruler, would be transmitted directly to his son. But Keith Murdoch died in 1952, when Rupert was only 21 years old. He was still at university at Oxford, studying philosophy, politics, and economics, subjects that would prove far less useful to him than the example his father had set and the practical education he would receive far away from academic settings. The inheritance that fell to Rupert was not enormous by the standards of great industrial fortunes. It was in fact relatively modest. A newspaper called the Adelaide News, a publication of modest circulation in a city that was, by international standards, quite remote and provincial. This is where the story truly begins to take its interesting shape, because what Rupert Murdoch inherited was not really a profitable business. It was, in fact, a failing one. The Adelaide News was losing money. It had limited circulation. In the eyes of many observers, it represented a sinking investment, a burden rather than an asset. And yet, in the hands of this young man, fresh from Oxford and armed with nothing except his father's example, his own ambitions, and an almost instinctive understanding of how to wield a newspaper as a weapon, this modest provincial publication would become the seed from which an empire would grow. Think about that for a moment. He didn't inherit a fortune that he then invested in media. He inherited a failing newspaper and, through a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and an almost preternatural understanding of what readers wanted and what advertisers needed, he transformed it. He cut costs ruthlessly. He sensationalized the stories. He understood, perhaps before many of his contemporaries, that newspapers didn't necessarily have to be repositories of serious journalism aimed at an educated elite. They could be weapons aimed at the emotions of ordinary people, and in doing so, they could be far more profitable and far more powerful than any broadsheet aimed at a handful of intellectuals. The Adelaide News began to grow, and as it grew, Rupert Murdoch's appetite for more newspapers, for more reach, for more control over the information landscape, grew with it. He was still young, barely out of his 20s, but he was operating with a clarity of vision and a certainty of purpose that suggested a man far older and far more experienced. He was buying, consolidating, expanding. Each newspaper he acquired became a platform from which to launch the acquisition of the next. Each market he entered became a stepping stone toward a larger market. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Rupert Murdoch was no longer simply a newspaper proprietor operating in the Australian provinces. He was becoming a significant figure in Australian media, a man whose influence was beginning to reach beyond the boundaries of Adelaide and into the larger cities of Melbourne and Sydney. And yet, Australia itself was beginning to feel too small for his ambitions. The question that was beginning to form in his mind, though perhaps he didn't articulate it consciously, was this: why should he limit himself to a country of fewer than 10 million people when there was a vast English-speaking world beyond, hungry for newspapers and ripe for the kind of transformation he had already begun in the Australian provinces? And so, in the early 1960s, Rupert Murdoch made a decision that would alter the trajectory not just of his own life, but of media and politics across the English-speaking world. He turned his attention outward, toward Great Britain. Britain in the early 1960s was still a nation of newspapers, where the printed press maintained an almost unquestioned authority over the shaping of public opinion. It was a market dominated by established players, by families and organizations that had controlled their properties for generations. And it was, from Rupert Murdoch's perspective, an opportunity waiting to be seized by someone with the courage and the ruthlessness to seize it. To understand how Rupert Murdoch came to shape the world's information landscape, we must first return to where his story truly began, not in the glittering towers of Manhattan or the glass-fronted offices of London's Fleet Street, but in the sprawling, unforgiving outback of South Australia, where his father, Keith Murdoch, had built something modest but meaningful, a newspaper empire that was, by almost any measure, small. Keith Murdoch had worked his way up through the ranks of Australian journalism with the kind of determination that marks men who must prove themselves, and by the 1950s, he had come to own several significant regional papers across the continent. These were not yet the instruments of global power. They were the quiet voices of cities like Adelaide and Perth, papers that shaped local opinion and held local institutions accountable. But they were his, and they were profitable, and they carried weight in their communities. Rupert was born into this world of newsprint and deadlines in 1931, the only son in a family that already understood, almost in their bones, what it meant to wield influence through information. His mother, Elizabeth, came from the Green family, whose own newspaper legacy in England stretched back generations, as though journalism were not simply a profession, but rather a kind of inherited calling, passed down like a surname or a family crest. From both sides of his family, then, Rupert inherited not just wealth and connections, but something more intangible, a sense that newspapers mattered, that they could move markets and shape minds, and that controlling them meant controlling something precious. His childhood was one of privilege, tempered by an education designed to prepare him for exactly this inheritance. He attended Geelong Grammar School, an institution that had the particular Australian quality of being both prestigious and rugged, and then, like many young men of his class and ambition, he went to Oxford University. At Oxford, in the late 1940s, Rupert was just another ambitious student. Yet even then, observers noticed something restless in him, a hunger that seemed to extend beyond the academic courtyard. He edited the student newspaper. He was involved in journalism even before he had the opportunity to inherit his father's papers. Already, as a young man, he was drawn to the mechanics of what made news matter to people. And then, in 1952, when Rupert was just 20 years old, his father died. Keith Murdoch was only 54, taken suddenly, leaving behind not only a widow and a son, but also an unfinished project, a media foothold that was substantial but not yet transcendent. What Rupert inherited was not a global empire, but something perhaps more valuable in its way, a platform, a set of newspapers with established relationships in their communities, and crucially, a young man's sense that there was far more to be done. Most of his peers, offered such an inheritance, might have been content to manage what they had received, to settle into comfortable proprietorship, and let the papers generate reliable income. But Rupert, it seems clear now, was animated by a different impulse. He returned to Australia from England, and he made a choice that would define the next several decades of his life. Rather than remaining in Adelaide where his family's newspapers were based, or attempting to expand modestly within Australia, he began to look outward, to see what lay beyond the comfortable certainty of inherited property. The Australian newspapers he had inherited provided him with capital, yes, and credibility, and the institutional knowledge of how newspapers operated. But they also provided him with something else. They provided him with a restlessness that capital alone cannot generate. He had access to a profession, to an industry, and to a philosophy of journalism that seemed to hold that newspapers should be not merely mirrors held up to society, but active forces within it. Whether for better or worse would become, of course, one of the great questions of the following decades. In the 1950s, Australian newspapers were changing. Television had not yet arrived to fragment the audience, but the old monopolies that had defined newspaper industries in smaller markets were beginning to feel vulnerable. Radio had already begun to chip away at their certainties. Rupert saw in this moment of transition an opportunity. Rather than managing decline or defending old turf, he began to think about how a newspaper might be reimagined for a new era. He was perhaps the first of his generation to understand, intuitively, rather than from any formal education, that the newspaper business was not truly in the business of paper at all. It was in the business of capturing attention, of aggregating readers, of creating the conditions under which advertising could reach large audiences. Everything else, the printing, the distribution, the editorial standards, these were merely the means to that end. In 1956, 4 years after inheriting his father's papers, Rupert made his first significant acquisition beyond what he had inherited. He purchased the Sunday Mail in Adelaide. It was a straightforward enough transaction on its surface, but it was significant for what it revealed about his ambitions and his tactics. He took a newspaper that was losing readers and losing money, and rather than attempting to restore it to some imagined former glory through increased editorial expense or higher standards of journalism, he did something much bolder. He simplified the paper. He made it more sensational. He began to understand what readers actually wanted, rather than what editors believed they ought to be reading. Circulation began to climb, and with circulation came advertising revenue, and with advertising revenue came profit. This was not, it should be said, a revolutionary insight. Tabloid sensationalism had a long history, stretching back well before Rupert was born, But what distinguished his approach was something more systematic, a kind of clarity about the relationship between content, audience, and money that was almost pitiless in its logic. A story mattered not because it was important, not because it illuminated some aspect of human experience, not because it held power to account, though occasionally it might do all of these things, but because it would attract readers, and readers, in their turn, attracted advertising. And advertising was profit. This was not cynicism exactly. It was something more like an absence of cynicism, a refusal to pretend that journalism was motivated by higher purposes when its actual function was to create profitable relationships between advertisers and audiences. With this philosophy in place, Rupert began to expand. The early decades of his ownership were marked by a kind of relentless acquisition, the careful building of a portfolio of newspapers across Australia that would give him leverage and reach. Each acquisition followed a similar pattern. A newspaper struggling to compete would come on the market. Murdoch would purchase it at a reasonable price. He would then apply his formula: reduced costs, simplified content, an emphasis on stories and angles that would sell papers. Some of his acquisitions began to gain considerable market share. The profits, reinvested, allowed him to purchase more newspapers, and with more newspapers came more political influence, more ability to shape public conversation, more power. By the early 1960s, Rupert Murdoch was no longer simply the inheritor of his father's modest Australian newspaper empire. He was becoming a media entrepreneur of considerable significance within Australia itself, a man whose papers reached millions of readers, whose decisions about what to publish and what to emphasize could influence elections and shift public opinion. He was, in other words, approaching the moment in his life when he would begin to think beyond Australia, when the relatively constrained canvas of Australian journalism would begin to feel insufficient. He was still in his 30s, still young enough to build something vast, and Australia, for all its size and resources, was ultimately a small and distant market compared to the possibilities that lay elsewhere. The question that began to animate his thinking was not how to make his Australian newspapers more profitable. That problem was already being solved. The question was how to extend his reach beyond Australia and into the larger, more powerful media markets of the English-speaking world. The Adelaide News, then, became Murdoch's true education in the mechanics of power. He learned that a newspaper was not merely a business of ink and paper. It was, fundamentally, an instrument of influence. What you print shapes what people believe, and what people believe shapes politics, commerce, society itself. The realization settled into him like a slow-moving certainty, and it would guide nearly every decision he would make for the next 7 decades. By the mid-1950s, the Australian media landscape was beginning to shift. The conservative establishment controlled most of the major outlets. Old money, old families, old thinking had calcified around the country's newsrooms and boardrooms alike. Murdoch saw an opening. He understood something his competitors perhaps did not: that the public's appetite for news was far more robust, far more varied than the newspapers of Australia were willing to feed them. There was a hunger for stories that spoke to ordinary lives, that didn't genuflect endlessly to the powerful, that asked difficult questions and published answers that made people uncomfortable in their living rooms. In 1954, Murdoch acquired the Sunday Mail in Adelaide. Then, in a move that would signal his ambitions far beyond South Australia, he purchased the News and the Sunday Mail in Brisbane, the capital city of Queensland. Brisbane was different from Adelaide, larger, more competitive, more attuned to the rhythms of national politics. The Australian media at that moment was still very much shaped by the aftermath of World War II, by Cold War anxieties, by a particular Australian conservatism that maintained close ties to Britain. Murdoch's papers began to reflect a different sensibility, not radical exactly, but willing to question, to probe, to treat readers as though they possessed intelligence and curiosity. What began to emerge in these years was a distinctive Murdoch formula, though he would refine it obsessively throughout his life. Lead with stories that mattered to the working person. Don't condescend, but don't demand too much education either. Use photographs liberally. Make the paper vivid, immediate, urgent. And perhaps most importantly, understand that readers want to feel as though their newspaper is on their side, is fighting for them against distant elites and entrenched interests. This was not invented by Murdoch, of course. American tabloids had been deploying these tactics for generations. But in Australia, where the media establishment had remained relatively genteel and restrained, it felt almost revolutionary. The 1950s saw the Cold War intensify around the globe, and Australia was not immune to these tensions. The Korean War had only recently ended. Communism seemed to many in the West like a creeping shadow, a threat that could materialize anywhere at any moment. Australia's government, under Prime Minister Robert Menzies, leaned toward the anti-communist hard line, toward alliance with Britain and America, toward a vision of the nation's future as firmly anchored in the Western Bloc. Murdoch's papers, as they grew in circulation and influence, broadly reflected these geopolitical positions. But they did so in a register that felt fresh, that spoke directly to the anxieties and hopes of ordinary Australians rather than lecturing them about duty or virtue. By the late 1950s, Murdoch had accumulated a small but growing chain of newspapers across Australia. He was not yet dominant, that would come later, but he was undeniably rising, and as his influence grew, so too did his appetite for larger challenges. Australia, he began to recognize, was ultimately too small a stage for the ambitions that were forming in his mind. The country had fewer than 10 million people. The advertising market was limited. The truly powerful media companies, the ones that shaped global discourse and exercised influence on the world stage, were headquartered in London and New York. This realization arrived gradually, like the awareness of dawn breaking across water. Murdoch was in his 20s still, young enough to remake himself, ambitious enough to believe that the rules that constrained other men need not constrain him. The question that began to form in his mind, though perhaps he could not have articulated it in such explicit terms at the time, was something like this. If I can reshape Australian journalism in my image, why should I stop at Australia's borders? What would prevent a man from Adelaide from conquering the media landscape of the entire English-speaking world? It was not arrogance exactly, though there was certainly some of that. It was rather a particular kind of confidence that emerges sometimes in brilliant, ambitious people, the sense that the rules written by others are merely suggestions, that convention exists to be challenged, that the world is far more malleable than the timid assume. His father had been, by all accounts, a man of genuine principle, bound by a certain code of honor that defined what a newspaper should be and do. The son inherited his father's drive, but not, perhaps, his restraint. Where Keith had believed in journalism as a calling, bound by responsibilities to truth and the public good, Rupert was beginning to see journalism as a tool that happened to be extraordinarily effective at concentrating power. The 1950s, then, were years of consolidation and learning for Murdoch. He was building a machine, yes, but more than that, he was building an understanding of how media actually functioned in society, how it shaped narratives, how it could elevate some voices and diminish others, how it could make certain ideas seem inevitable and certain people seem heroic or contemptible depending on which photographs you chose to print and what headlines you placed above them. These lessons, absorbed in the Australian context, in an era when he was not yet powerful enough to distort reality with ease, would become the foundation for everything that followed. He was learning the language of power in its most subtle and pervasive form, not the power to coerce, but the power to persuade, the power to frame, the power to decide what stories matter and which ones should be forgotten. By the early 1970s, Rupert Murdoch had already begun to reshape the British newspaper landscape with a touch both shrewd and restless. The Sun, which he acquired in 1969, was a paper in trouble, circulation spiraling downward, staff morale collapsing under years of neglect and editorial confusion. Most proprietors might have simply tried to steady the ship. Murdoch, though, saw something else entirely. He saw an opportunity to completely reimagine what a newspaper could be to ordinary people, and in doing so, to command their attention in ways his competitors had never quite managed. The transformation of the Sun is, in many ways, the moment that defined his entire empire. He appointed a young editor named Larry Lamb, a man with an instinct for what would capture the imagination of working-class readers. Stories of sport and scandal, of scandal most of all, but told with a kind of irreverent playfulness, rather than the stuffiness of the broadsheets. Within a few years, the Sun's circulation began to climb. Then it soared. By the mid-70s, it had become Britain's best-selling newspaper, surpassing even the staid Daily Mirror, which had once seemed unshakable in its dominance. How does a struggling paper transform into a national phenomenon so quickly? The answer lies partly in Murdoch's willingness to abandon every convention about what a serious newspaper should be. The masthead carried headlines that shocked the establishment. Photographs of bare-breasted women became a regular feature. Pages 3 through 5 often devoted to what became known colloquially as Page 3 girls. Conservative critics howled in protest. Women's organizations objected. Yet each objection seemed only to deepen public curiosity. The Sun's sales climbed higher still. Murdoch understood something fundamental about how attention works in a democracy, that outrage itself is a form of engagement, and engagement is profitable. The paper didn't simply report the news, it manufactured conversation around the news, and around itself. What's often overlooked in discussions of the Sun's rise is that beneath the sensationalism was actually quite shrewd political coverage. The paper understood that working-class readers cared about wages, about job security, about the unions that fought for better conditions. Murdoch saw political opportunity here too. He began to cultivate relationships with powerful figures in Parliament and beyond, building what would eventually become a form of political influence rarely seen in modern democracies. A newspaper that reached millions each morning, read in break rooms and on buses and at kitchen tables across the nation. Such a paper was not merely a business. It was a vehicle for shaping how people understood the world. During this same period, Murdoch was also acquiring television assets. In 1981, he purchased the Times of London and the Sunday Times, properties that carried centuries of institutional weight and prestige. The newspaper world was stunned. The Times had been owned by the Thompson family. The Sunday Times had been considered among the finest examples of serious journalism anywhere in the English-speaking world. That Murdoch, known principally for the Sun's raucous sensationalism, should own both papers simultaneously seemed almost like a contradiction written into the fabric of the universe. Yet this is precisely what made the acquisition so revealing about Murdoch's strategy. He wasn't interested in making the Times into a tabloid. He wanted to own both the high and the low, the serious and the sensational, the establishment and the populist. He could shape debate at the level of policy elites, while simultaneously shaping sentiment among the masses. This is a form of power that goes beyond what any single publication can wield. It's the power that comes from owning entire segments of the information ecosystem. When you control the paper that intellectuals read and the paper that ordinary people read, you control not just what stories get told, but whose version of reality wins out when different accounts collide. The acquisition of the Times came with significant strings attached. Murdoch clashed with the paper's journalists almost immediately. The newsroom had its own culture, its own standards, its own sense of how journalism ought to be conducted. Murdoch brought in his own people. his own management philosophy, and the collision was inevitable and, in many ways, generative of the tensions that would define his stewardship of these institutions for decades to come. Some of the finest journalists of that era found themselves working under an owner whose instincts were often at odds with their own deepest professional commitments. Yet Murdoch also attracted talented people who saw in him a kind of visionary, someone willing to invest in journalism at a scale most proprietors wouldn't consider. By the middle of the 1980s, Murdoch's empire had grown beyond the British Isles. He had launched Sky Television, a satellite broadcasting venture that would eventually transform how people received information and entertainment in Britain. He controlled significant newspaper assets in Australia, where he had grown up and where his family maintained deep roots. And he was beginning to eye opportunities in the United States, where the most powerful media landscape of all awaited. The pattern was becoming clear. Murdoch acquired assets not because they fit together logically, but because they expanded his reach and his influence. Coherence wasn't the goal, dominance was. There's something worth pausing on here. Most business empires are built around a specific idea, a better product, a more efficient process, a particular technological innovation. Murdoch's empire was built around something more abstract, the idea that whoever controls the flow of information has power that extends far beyond mere commerce. The business logic was always secondary to the strategic logic. As long as the properties made money, they served his larger purpose. And most of them did make money, at least for stretches. But the underlying principle, that media ownership conferred a form of influence and authority that transcended the normal rules of democratic capitalism, was always present, always driving acquisitions, always shaping decisions about editorial direction and business strategy. By the late 80s and early 90s, Murdoch had begun to think about succession. He had 4 children from his first 2 marriages, Prudence, Elizabeth, Lachlan, and James. As his empire grew more complex, the question of who would inherit it and how it would be divided began to occupy his thinking. This is the moment where the empire that had been built with such ruthless determination and singular vision began, inevitably, to fracture along lines of personality, ambition, and family conflict. The seeds of the divisions that would eventually tear the empire apart were sown not by external forces, but by the very structure of succession that any multi-generational dynasty must eventually confront. How does one man's vision of power translate into institutional structures that can survive his departure? What happens when children raised with privilege must inherit empires built on the absolute certainty of a single voice making all the important decisions? By the early 1970s, Rupert Murdoch had already proven himself a different kind of newspaper proprietor, not content to simply inherit and manage what his father had left him, but driven to acquire, to expand, to reshape every property he touched, according to a very particular vision of what the news ought to be. His papers had developed a distinctive voice, populist, energetic, sometimes transgressive, always hungry for the story that would make people pause on the newsstand. The Australian had become a powerful force in its own right, and his ownership of the Brisbane Courier Mail gave him a significant foothold in Queensland's media landscape. But Australia, no matter how ambitious his plans there, was always going to feel provincial to someone with his appetite. The natural next step was Britain, and it was Britain that would transform him from a wealthy Australian publisher into something far larger, a figure who would eventually shape not just newspapers, but the very texture of how millions of people understood the world around them. In 1969, at the age of 38, Murdoch made his move into the British market by acquiring the News of the World, a Sunday newspaper that had been publishing for over a century. The News of the World was already known for its sensationalism, its exposure of scandal and crime, its peculiar blend of moral outrage and prurient fascination. It was, in many ways, perfectly aligned with what Murdoch believed newspapers should be. Readers loved it. It had millions of them, and in Murdoch's hands, its already substantial circulation would grow even further. But the acquisition was controversial. The existing ownership had tried to prevent him from taking control, and Murdoch's aggressive tactics in securing the paper had made him enemies among the British establishment. There were those who saw him as a threat, an outsider, someone who understood too well how to appeal to readers' baser instincts, and who might use that power in ways that stretched the boundaries of responsible journalism. Yet this was precisely what made Murdoch dangerous, and, to his supporters, precisely what made him necessary. British journalism in the late 1960s had developed a certain stuffiness, an assumption that the papers should maintain distance from their readers, that there was a proper way to report news that involved restraint and a kind of institutional dignity. Murdoch looked at this landscape and saw opportunity. If he could make the news of the world even more vital, even more engaging, even more willing to explore stories that others considered beneath serious consideration, he could build something extraordinary. Barely a year after acquiring the News of the World, he purchased another British newspaper, the Sunday Times, a much more established, respectable publication that occupied a different space in the British media ecosystem, where the news of the world appealed to working-class readers with lurid headlines and crime stories. The Sunday Times was read by the educated, affluent, intellectual classes. It was known for serious investigative journalism, for its culture and arts coverage, for a certain gravitas. For Murdoch to own both papers simultaneously seemed almost contradictory. How could a single proprietor preside over such different editorial voices? And yet for Murdoch, there was a logic to it. He was building not just a newspaper empire, but a media presence that could speak to Britain at every level, from the factory floor to the drawing room. The message was clear. I own your newspapers. The ones you read in the morning, the ones you read on Sunday, the ones that confirm your prejudices, and the ones that challenge your assumptions. The acquisitions of the News of the World and the Sunday Times were watershed moments, not merely for Murdoch's personal ambitions, but for the shape of British media itself. Other newspaper proprietors began to sense that the industry was changing, that the old certainties about how journalism should be conducted were being challenged. And in the years that followed, as Murdoch's influence grew, questions began to emerge about the relationship between a media proprietor's power and his responsibility. Did owning newspapers give Murdoch the right to shape political outcomes? Did his control over what millions of people read constitute a form of power that ought to be constrained? These were not new questions. Newspaper magnates had wielded influence for centuries, but they took on a new urgency in the age of mass literacy and mass media. What is perhaps most fascinating to consider, as we sit with these developments, is how Murdoch's entry into Britain seemed to confirm for both his admirers and his critics exactly what they suspected about him. His supporters saw in his aggressive tactics and his willingness to challenge the established order a refreshing departure from the complacency of traditional media. His critics saw the beginning of something darker, the emergence of a proprietor who cared less about journalism as a craft or a calling and more about media as a tool for accumulation and influence. Neither view was entirely accurate, and neither was entirely wrong. The truth, as is often the case with complicated figures, lay somewhere in between, in the space where ambition and conviction can become indistinguishable from one another. The 1970s would see Murdoch consolidate his British holdings and extend his reach even further. But before we turn to those developments, it is worth pausing on what had already happened, on the foundation that had been laid. Within just a few years, a man who was still in his 30s had become a significant player in one of the world's most important media markets. He had done so not through inheritance or through the gradual accumulation of respectability, but through shrewd deal-making, through an instinctive understanding of what readers wanted and through a willingness to move faster and more aggressively than his competitors. It was a formula that would shape everything that came after. By the time Murdoch was consolidating his Australian empire in the 1960s, the nature of his relationship with power had already become clear. He did not merely report the news, he shaped it, and more than that, he understood something that most publishers of his era were only beginning to dimly perceive: that controlling the way information moved through society was, in many ways, more valuable than controlling the information itself. His newspapers became instruments of influence that extended far beyond their pages. Political candidates learned quickly that an endorsement from a Murdoch paper could shift an election. Business figures understood that a sustained campaign in his tabloids could ruin a reputation or elevate one, and governments, whether they admitted it or not, found themselves constantly calculating how to manage this mercurial man who could deliver millions of readers' attention whenever he chose to deploy it. The Australian Broadcasting Commission, the ABC as it was known, represented something of a natural rival. It was publicly funded, editorially independent by law, and utterly beyond Murdoch's reach. For a man accustomed to bending institutions to his will, this must have felt like an intolerable gap in his dominion, and so began a long, patient campaign to diminish the ABC's authority, to paint it as elitist and out of touch, to suggest that public broadcasting was a luxury the nation could not afford. These attacks would echo across decades. Yet within Australia, Murdoch's ambitions were beginning to feel constrained. The country, for all its size, had only so many readers, only so many advertisers. The real expansion, he sensed, would have to come elsewhere. Britain, in particular, called to him. It was the cradle of English-language journalism, home to papers of global influence and prestige. The Times and the Telegraph were institutions that shaped not merely their nation, but the entire Anglophone world's understanding of itself. In 1968, Murdoch made his first significant British acquisition. He purchased the Sunday Times, and with it, he stepped onto a stage that was altogether grander and more complex than anything he had navigated before. British journalism operated according to unwritten codes of conduct that had evolved over centuries. There were clubby understandings among proprietors, assumptions about what was done and what was simply not mentioned in polite society. Murdoch, the colonial outsider, cared little for such conventions. But he was also shrewd enough to understand that British newspapers could not be run quite like Australian ones. The audience was more educated, more skeptical of obvious partisan manipulation, more attuned to questions of journalistic ethics. So his approach was in some ways more subtle. He would elevate the editorial quality of the papers he acquired, even as he bent them to serve his broader interests. He would hire brilliant editors and journalists, sometimes even allow them genuine editorial independence on matters that did not touch his core concerns. It was a sophisticated strategy: build credibility through excellent journalism, then leverage that credibility for political influence. The Sunday Times flourished under his ownership. Its investigative journalism became renowned. It won awards. Yet it also, gradually, began to reflect Murdoch's worldview, his skepticism toward the left, his suspicion of large institutions he could not control, his instinctive alignment with conservative political forces. The influence was rarely crude. It was almost always deniable. But it was there, woven through the fabric of editorial decisions made over months and years. This period also saw Murdoch beginning to develop a philosophy about the relationship between ownership and editorial control. He would later claim that he did not personally direct editorial content, that he hired capable editors and largely left them to their work. Yet those editors understood, without needing explicit instruction, what kinds of stories the proprietor preferred. They knew which politicians he favored. They sensed the limits of his tolerance. It was a form of influence that operated mostly through osmosis, through the slow internalization of a worldview, rather than through direct commands. Many of his editors, when confronted with accusations of bias, could genuinely claim that they had never received an explicit order from Murdoch, and yet the papers still bent toward his preferences. The British acquisition also marked a turning point in how Murdoch began to see his role. He was no longer simply a newspaper proprietor, someone who happened to own the means of mass communication. He had begun to conceive of himself as a force in politics itself. When Murdoch supported a political leader, that leader received favorable coverage from his papers. When he opposed one, that leader found himself subject to intense scrutiny, his actions interpreted through a skeptical lens, his statements fact-checked with an almost punitive severity. Margaret Thatcher would later emerge as perhaps the most significant beneficiary of this arrangement. But even before Thatcher, even before the explicit political alliances that would define the 1980s, the pattern was establishing itself. Murdoch used his newspapers not primarily to express his own views, though he had strong ones, but to construct narratives that served his interests and those of the political forces he favored. He was, in essence, building a parallel reality within his pages, one in which his allies were noble and his rivals were suspect. This raises a perhaps uncomfortable question. At what point does the proprietor of newspapers stop being a mere businessman and become something more like a political operator? And once that line is crossed, if it can be said to be a clear line at all, what responsibilities follow? These were not questions that much concerned Murdoch. He had always believed that those with power should use it. His newspapers were his power, and he would deploy them as he saw fit. The late 1960s and early 1970s also saw personal upheaval. Murdoch's marriage to Patricia Booker, his first wife, was deteriorating. They would eventually divorce. His second marriage, to Anna Murdoch in 1967, was still relatively new, and while it would produce children and appear, for a time, to be a stable partnership, it too would eventually founder. But these personal dramas receive less attention in histories of the Murdoch Empire than they perhaps deserve. A man navigating the demands of building a global media operation while his personal life was unraveling. How did that affect his judgment, his ethics, his ambitions? We can only speculate. What we do know is that by the early 1970s, Murdoch's vision had begun to expand dramatically beyond newspapers. Television was the future. He could see that with crystal clarity, and he wanted it. By the 1980s, Murdoch had already begun to see the shape of a new world forming on the horizon, one that television alone could not fully command. The power he had accumulated through News Corporation was vast, yes, but the landscape itself was shifting beneath his feet in ways both terrifying and exhilarating. He had built an empire on the understanding that media was not merely about content, it was about access, about knowing what people would consume before they themselves knew it, about shaping the conversation that would ripple through living rooms and workplaces the following morning. Yet there was a restlessness in him that even his considerable holdings could not fully satisfy. The Australian roots that had nurtured his ambitions felt increasingly provincial. America, with its sprawling markets and limitless appetite for sensation, beckoned like a challenge he could not ignore. And so in 1981, Murdoch made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of not only his own life, but of information itself, as it would be distributed across the Western world. He purchased the Wall Street Journal through the parent company Dow Jones, an acquisition that seemed almost casual in its execution, but was in fact a declaration of something far more profound. The move bewildered the old money establishment. How could a tabloid proprietor, a man whose career had been built on scandal sheets and racing guides and bold, sensationalist headlines, ever be trusted with one of the most respected financial publications in the world? The question itself reveals the anxiety that surrounded Murdoch's rise. He had never fit the mold of a gentleman publisher. He did not dine in the right clubs or inherit his wealth through generations of careful accumulation. He was something newer, rawer, more hungry. And hungry men, history teaches us, tend to transform whatever they touch. What happened next was a slow, deliberate reshaping of the journal itself. Not all at once, not in ways that would trigger immediate revolt, but gradually, incrementally, so that by the time readers fully understood what had occurred, the transformation was nearly complete. The news pages began to take on a different tone, still authoritative, still rigorously reported, but written with an energy that the old journal had eschewed. The opinion section, long a bastion of establishment conservatism, began to reflect a more populist sensibility. Murdoch understood, with an almost intuitive clarity, that the future of media belonged not to those who lectured from on high, but to those who spoke in the language of their audience, who validated their suspicions and their grievances while maintaining just enough veneer of legitimacy to seem trustworthy. During these same years, another venture was taking shape across the country that would prove equally consequential. Fox Television, initially envisioned as a fourth American network to compete with the established trinity of ABC, NBC, and CBS, was a gamble of extraordinary proportions. When Murdoch gained control of it, many seasoned observers in broadcasting believed he was throwing money into a fire that would only consume itself. A new network, starting from nothing, attempting to compete against titans who had decades of infrastructure and audience loyalty? It seemed like folly. But Murdoch saw something that the skeptics could not quite perceive. He understood that the existing networks had become complacent, that they were still operating on the assumption that audiences would accept whatever was offered to them because there were few other options. He saw the power vacuum that technology was creating, cable systems spreading across the country, the possibility of reaching niche audiences with specialized content, the hunger for something that spoke to people who felt abandoned by the mainstream broadcasters. How is it that one man, operating across continents and industries, managed to comprehend shifts in human behavior before those shifts had fully announced themselves? This is perhaps the deepest mystery of Murdoch's success. Part of it was surely his willingness to fail, his comfort with risk in ways that old money operators could never quite embrace. Failure, to Murdoch, was not shameful, it was information. It told you something about the market, about what audiences wanted, about where the real leverage lay. And so he moved forward with Fox, pouring resources into programming that the established networks had deemed too risky, too niche, too much of a gamble. As Fox took shape through the mid-1980s, another dimension of Murdoch's vision was crystallizing in Britain and Europe. He had not forgotten his roots, his early understanding of mass circulation and tabloid appetite. The Sun had become something of a flagship property, a constant generator of profit and influence. But Murdoch's eye was now drawn to the question of what happened when you combined newspaper power with broadcasting power, when you could shape the story in print and then amplify it through television and eventually through new technologies that were just beginning to emerge from laboratories and development studios around the world. The infrastructure for dominance was being assembled piece by piece. Each acquisition seemed logical in isolation, each venture justified on its own merits. Yet the pattern, when viewed from above, revealed something more systematic, a slow consolidation of the ability to shape not just what people knew, but how they understood their world, what seemed important, which stories mattered, which voices deserved to be heard. It is worth pausing here to consider what Murdoch had learned from his early years in Australia, from the competition with his father's legacy. He had learned that power in media flowed not from the quality of your analysis or the depth of your investigations, though these things mattered. It flowed from something more fundamental, from knowing your audience better than anyone else did, from giving them what they craved even, or perhaps especially, when they themselves weren't entirely sure what that was. He had learned that money followed audience, that influence followed money, and that if you controlled enough of the pathways through which information flowed, you effectively controlled far more than just the media landscape. You began to shape politics itself, to influence the decisions of politicians who depended on your platforms to reach voters. The 1980s and early 1990s saw the full flowering of these insights. The Australian properties, while still profitable, were increasingly small pieces of a much larger puzzle. American expansion was accelerating. British newspapers and broadcasting interests were deepening. Murdoch was becoming, in effect, a bridge between continents, a carrier of impulses from one market to another. When he discovered that a tabloid technique worked in London, he adapted it for New York. When Australian readers responded to a particular sensational headline or editorial approach, he understood that American audiences might respond similarly. This was his genius, not mere copying, but a sophisticated understanding of underlying human appetites that transcended borders and cultures, appetites that were perhaps more universal than the educated classes wanted to acknowledge. The empire that was being built during these decades was not always visible in its full extent, even to those who were paying close attention. The connections between different properties seemed, on the surface, to be purely financial or operational. But there was something more architectural happening, something that suggested a grand design, a vision of how information could be controlled and directed across multiple mediums and multiple nations simultaneously. It was during these years that the seeds of future scandals were being sown, future controversies that would eventually demand a reckoning. But at the time, in the momentum of expansion and the intoxication of consistent success, these dangers seemed distant, almost theoretical. The transformation that took hold in the 1980s marked a turning point so profound that those who watched it unfold would later describe the shift as almost geological, a slow, relentless grinding of continents that altered the entire landscape. Murdoch had built his empire on the foundation of acquiring newspapers, yes, but now he saw something beyond the printed page. Television had become the true power, the instrument that could shape consciousness itself, and he moved toward it with the same hunger that had driven him to acquire the Australian across decades of competition and audacity. In America, his path had been constrained by law. Foreign ownership of broadcast licenses carried restrictions so tight they might as well have been walls. But there existed a pathway through those walls, and Murdoch had always been someone who understood pathways, the ones official channels overlooked, the gaps in regulation where ambition could flow like water finding its level. He would build Fox Broadcasting Company from scattered assets and independent stations, a venture that many in the industry dismissed as quixotic, even foolish. Why would an outsider, an Australian immigrant, attempt to launch a fourth major television network when three great institutions had already calcified the market into something that seemed immovable? And yet here lay the peculiar alchemy of Murdoch's mind. He saw not impossibility, but opportunity. He saw an audience that the established networks had abandoned or never truly understood. The early 1980s saw the American television landscape divided almost ritually among NBC, ABC, and CBS. These three networks controlled not just the programming, but the very definition of what Americans watched, what they discussed, what they understood about the world. The structure felt ordained, almost constitutional, but Murdoch observed something others had overlooked: the demographic fractures, the audiences underserved, the programming gaps that grew wider each year. He began acquiring independent television stations in major markets: Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. Small holdings at first, nothing that caused the establishment to lose sleep. He held them as pieces on a board, waiting for the moment to arrange them into a coherent network. The vision crystallized gradually. He would need content, not the staid, middle-of-the-road entertainment that the three networks peddled with such confidence. He would need something with energy, something that spoke to audiences whom the major networks treated as peripheral. Reality television was not yet a term in common usage, though its seeds had been planted. Game shows and soap operas and sports programming could fill hours. More importantly, news could be reshaped, reimagined as entertainment rather than merely information. And beneath it all, beneath the visible architecture of Fox, Murdoch understood a truth that others were only beginning to glimpse, that control of media was control of narrative, and control of narrative was control of what people believed to be true. The building of Fox in the mid-80s consumed enormous resources and vast amounts of patience, a patience that Murdoch could exercise because he did not need immediate returns. He had the wealth of his worldwide operations to fund the venture. He had audacity without limit. What he did not have, and what troubled him more than most would admit, was guarantee of success. Television networks were not like newspapers. They were hungry beasts that required constant feeding with content, with talent, with marketing. They were visible in ways that newspapers, for all their influence, could never be. The risks were accordingly immense. Yet as the network took form, something unexpected began to crystallize. Not the network itself, which was still years away from actual broadcast, but the recognition among Murdoch's own organization that something fundamental was shifting. The empire was no longer just a collection of publications. It was becoming something more integrated, more ambitious, more architecturally coherent. Television would amplify the reach of his newspapers. Newspapers would lend credibility to his television stations. Together, they would form something more powerful than any single medium could achieve alone. This was the true innovation, not the Fox network itself, but the realization that these instruments could be played in concert. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Murdoch's grip on British media was deepening in ways that troubled the British establishment in ways they could barely articulate. He had acquired the Times of London in 1981, a moment that felt to the British intelligentsia like a kind of cultural vandalism. The Times was not merely a newspaper, it was an institution, a voice that had shaped British thought and policy for nearly 2 centuries. For it to pass into the hands of an Australian seemed to many a kind of betrayal, though betrayal by whom and to whom remained unclear. Murdoch, characteristically, was unmoved by such sentimental attachment to tradition. He saw the Times as a tool, an acquisition that completed his influence across the English-speaking world. What happened in the years following the acquisition revealed something essential about Murdoch's philosophy, something that would echo through decades to come. The Times had been a loss-making operation, a prestige publication that influenced the powerful even as it hemorrhaged money. Murdoch's instinct was to rationalize, to streamline, to make it profitable. This meant harder journalism in some respects, more aggressive news gathering, but also a subtle shift in emphasis. The newspaper would not become tabloid in form, but it would in spirit begin to serve different masters. Where the Times had once prided itself on independent editorial judgment, insulated from commercial pressure, Murdoch's model demanded alignment with his broader business interests. The transition was not sudden or obvious. It happened in the spaces between editorial decisions, in the hiring and promotion of journalists who understood which stories served the proprietor's interests and which did not. This was the machinery of the empire in its maturity, not crude or obvious, but subtle and pervasive. The question that haunted those who understood what was happening was a simple one. If one man controlled the newspapers, the television stations, the very instruments through which information flowed to millions of people, what did that mean for democracy itself? The question was asked quietly, in academic settings and editorial conferences, but it would eventually demand louder answers. For now, though, in the mid-80s, Murdoch continued to expand, to acquire, to reshape the media landscape according to his vision, largely unchallenged because his ambitions were so vast that regulation had not yet caught up with his scale. By the late 1980s, Murdoch had begun to see the world through a particular lens, one shaped by his own experience of outsider status, his appetite for power, and increasingly, his conviction that television was no longer simply a business, but a tool through which to shape nations themselves. The vision was grand. It was also, in many ways, lonely. His newspapers had given him influence in the corridors of politics and commerce, but they were bound to geography, to printing presses, to distribution networks that could break down. Television transcended all of that. Television entered homes. It shaped what people thought before they had time to think it themselves. Murdoch understood this perhaps more intuitively than anyone else in the 1980s, when most media proprietors still saw broadcasting as a separate realm, a distinct business requiring different skills and different temperaments. What makes this moment in his story so poignant, if you allow yourself to sit with it, is the recognition that Murdoch was not wrong about the future. He was simply racing toward it, with a hunger that would eventually consume the very institutions he built. The question, in those quieter hours of a boardroom or a study, might have been whether expansion and dominion were truly the same thing as lasting power. But if Murdoch asked that question, there is little record of him doing so aloud. In America, the regulatory landscape was different from what he had navigated in Australia or the United Kingdom. The Federal Communications Commission had rules designed, ostensibly, to prevent foreign ownership of broadcast licenses. Murdoch was an Australian citizen. Technically, he could not own an American television network, but technical obstacles had never stopped him before. What was law but a negotiation with those who wrote it? In 1985, Murdoch became a naturalized American citizen. It was a pragmatic transformation, one that eliminated the legal impediment to his ambitions without requiring him to abandon his essential character. He remained, in temperament and instinct, the ambitious outsider from Adelaide. But now he had the paperwork to match his appetites. The timing was precise, calculated, and it opened a door that had been sealed shut. Almost immediately, he moved to acquire broadcast licenses. Within 2 years, he had assembled enough stations to create what would become the Fox network, a venture that seemed, to many observers at the time, almost quixotic. The 3 major networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, had dominated American broadcasting for nearly 3 decades. The idea that a newcomer, however well-funded and strategically minded, could fracture that oligopoly seemed almost fantastical. Yet Fox was not conceived as a network that would simply imitate the established order. Murdoch and his lieutenants, particularly a man named Barry Diller, understood that the mass audience was changing. Younger viewers were turning away from the stately news broadcasts and the family sitcoms that had sustained the networks through their golden age. There was hunger for something rawer, more confrontational, more willing to push against the boundaries of what television had previously been permitted to show and discuss. Fox would feed that hunger. It would be cheaper to produce, more willing to court controversy, and designed from the ground up to reach those whom the established networks had begun to take for granted. In retrospect, the ambition looks inevitable, but at the time, plenty of very intelligent people believed Murdoch was throwing money at a fantasy, that American broadcasting had already found its permanent shape, and that no outsider, no matter how ruthless or well-resourced, could reshape it. Those people did not fully account for how thoroughly Murdoch understood the mechanics of audience desire, that wish, so fundamental and so frequently unexamined, to see something that the authorities would prefer you not to see, to hear something that establishment institutions have deemed unsuitable for your consumption. The launch of Fox in October 1986 was not a triumph. Ratings were modest. The network hemorrhaged money. The programs that filled its schedule were, in many cases, derivative or low quality. But Murdoch was patient, in a way that many of his critics were not. He had learned, over decades of building newspapers, that cultural influence did not arrive overnight. It accumulated. It grew in the soil of repetition, accessibility, and the subtle reshaping of what seemed normal and natural. Television worked the same way, only faster. As the network found its footing, something else was happening in parallel. The newspaper empires that Murdoch had built in Australia and the United Kingdom had made him fabulously wealthy, but they had also made him a polarizing figure. Journalists in those countries grew accustomed to accusations that his papers were too sensationalist, too willing to cross ethical lines in pursuit of a story, too devoted to the political interests of their proprietor. In Australia, he was sometimes spoken of with a mixture of grudging admiration and genuine alarm, a visionary who had transformed his nation's media landscape, but at a cost that was not always tallied in financial terms. Here is where the nature of his power becomes most difficult to examine clearly, because Murdoch was not simply accumulating newspapers and television licenses. He was accumulating the infrastructure through which millions of people understood the world. He was in a position to decide, not always consciously, and not always in a way he would have acknowledged, what counted as news, what constituted a scandal, which political figures were presented as heroes, and which as villains, which stories were told, and which were allowed to fade into silence. And the question of whether such concentration of power in the hands of a single person and his circle of advisors was compatible with the health of democratic societies, well, that question was being asked, though not always loudly enough to be heard above the noise of expansion and acquisition. The 1990s would bring further consolidation. But before those years arrived, Murdoch had already begun to think about what a truly global media company might look like. Not simply newspapers and television stations scattered across different continents, but an interlocking system of ownership and influence that could function, in some senses, as a unified organism. That vision, too, was not without its beauties, but it carried within it the seeds of conflicts that would not become fully visible until much later, when the empire had grown large enough that its internal contradictions could no longer be easily hidden away. By the early 1980s, Rupert Murdoch had become something more than a newspaper proprietor. He was a man remaking the very definition of what a media empire could be, and the rules that had governed journalism for generations were beginning to bend under the weight of his ambition. The acquisition of the Times and the Sunday Times in 1981 marked a threshold moment, a crossing into territory that would have seemed, to the old newspaper families of Britain, almost unthinkable. These were papers of record, institutions wrapped in the mythology of impartiality and restraint, and now they belonged to a man whose entire career had been built on sensation and sensation's opposite, absolute editorial control. The purchase itself had been controversial, in ways that modern media acquisitions rarely are anymore. There were concerns raised in Parliament, questions about whether a single proprietor should hold such concentrated power over British newspaper publishing. But Murdoch understood something that his critics sometimes underestimated. He understood the loneliness of power, and he understood that the most effective way to hold it was to be willing to make decisions that others found too difficult to contemplate. He made the Times profitable again. He did this through a combination of ruthless cost-cutting and strategic reinvention, moving the paper into new territory while maintaining enough of its gravitas to preserve its influence. It was, in its way, a masterclass in transformation. What made this period remarkable, if we pause to consider it, was the simultaneity of his various projects. While he was reshaping the Times, he was also building Sky Television in Britain, a satellite broadcasting venture that would eventually revolutionize how people received their television signal and fundamentally alter the landscape of British broadcasting. Simultaneously, he was deepening his presence in the United States, preparing to acquire more properties, laying the groundwork for what would become his most audacious venture yet, the creation of Fox News. These were not sequential steps. They were overlapping investments in the future, each one supporting the others, each one designed to create a media ecosystem where Murdoch's influence could extend into almost every dimension of how information reached people. The United States represented a different kind of challenge than Britain or Australia, though Murdoch had never been deterred by the prospect of operating in unfamiliar territory. America's media landscape was fragmented in ways that European markets were not. It was larger, more diverse, more deeply skeptical of concentrated power. Yet it was also, in his view, underutilized. Television networks had grown comfortable. Newspapers had become predictable. There was room to disrupt, and disruption had always been his instrument. In 1976, he had purchased the New York Post, a struggling tabloid with a long and somewhat notorious history. Murdoch transformed it into something utterly his own, sensational, aggressive, and unapologetically populist. The Post became the American embodiment of everything his critics feared about his ownership, a paper uninterested in the subtleties of balanced reporting, committed instead to a particular worldview delivered with theatrical certainty. And yet it found an audience. Millions of New Yorkers read it. It became, in its way, culturally significant, but it also became a symbol of everything he represented to his opponents, the corruption of journalism by commerce and personality. Throughout this period, one of the recurring patterns in his career became increasingly visible, his willingness to become entangled with political power in ways that traditional media proprietors had avoided. He cultivated relationships with politicians across the ideological spectrum, but he was never neutral about which relationships he cultivated. He had moved clearly into the conservative orbit, supporting Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Ronald Reagan in America. Some of this was philosophical alignment, but some of it was also strategic. Politicians liked to know the proprietors of powerful media organizations, and proprietors, if they were honest with themselves, liked to know politicians. The question that began to emerge during this era, though perhaps not in any formal way, it was more a shadow that followed his enterprises, was whether Murdoch was using media to support political views, or whether he was allowing political relationships to shape editorial policy. The answer, one suspects, was that he had never really distinguished between the two. To him, owning a newspaper or a television network was not fundamentally different from any other business venture. The product you were selling was information and interpretation, and you shaped that product to meet the demands of your market and, perhaps more importantly, to align with your own understanding of the world. His personal life during these years, too, was in transition. His marriage to his second wife, Anna Murdoch, would produce 2 children, Elizabeth and James, adding another layer of complexity to questions about succession and inheritance that would eventually become central to the story of his empire. He had always been a man who maintained clear boundaries between his personal and professional worlds, yet these worlds were never truly separate. The fortune was being built as a family enterprise, even as the family itself remained somewhat remote from the public understanding of that enterprise. What strikes an observer looking back at this period is the sheer relentlessness of the expansion. There was no pause, no moment where Murdoch seemed to ask himself whether he had enough, whether he had achieved sufficient scale. Instead, each acquisition led to plans for another. Each success in one market informed strategies in the next. It was as if the empire building itself had become the point, not the wealth it generated, though that was substantial, but the act of extending influence, of reaching into new territories and new populations, of making his imprint on how millions of people understood the world around them. The 1980s then became a decade of consolidation and expansion simultaneously. He was protecting his existing holdings, fighting regulatory challenges, navigating the complex politics of different national governments, while also preparing the next generation of ventures that would define the final decades of his active career. And throughout all of this, even as his influence grew more visible and more controversial, Murdoch himself remained somewhat opaque. He gave few interviews. He avoided the spotlight in ways that many other business titans did not. He seemed to understand that his power was more absolute, his influence more pervasive, if he remained slightly removed from public scrutiny, a figure glimpsed occasionally, but never fully illuminated. In this quietness, in this refusal to perform his power for cameras and journalists, lay perhaps his greatest strength. He did not need to convince people of his importance through rhetoric or presentation. He simply was important. His decisions shaped the media landscape. His choices determined which stories reached millions of people and which remained untold. That is a form of authority that requires no announcement, no performance. It simply exists, quietly, persistently, woven into the fabric of information itself. By the early 1980s, Murdoch had already begun to sense a shift in the air. The old newspaper empires of the English-speaking world were not dying, exactly, but they were becoming something different. Less sovereign, less able to dictate to politicians and the public what should be believed. Television had entered nearly every home. Radio had splintered into 1,000 stations. The monolith was cracking, and Murdoch, who had spent his entire career learning how to control information within the constraints of paper and ink, understood that the future belonged not to those who clung to the old, but to those who could see what was coming and move toward it, while others were still looking backward. It was in this atmosphere of transformation that he began to look across the Atlantic with genuine intensity. America had always been present in his thinking. It was the great frontier, the proving ground where empires were either made or humbled. But his previous attempts there had been modest, almost cautious by his standards. He had acquired the New York Post in 1976, a tabloid with a storied past and a fading present, and he had done what he always did. He had sharpened its language, made it bolder, more confrontational, more willing to speak to the anxieties and resentments of people who felt unheard by the mainstream press. The Post became a vehicle for a particular vision of New York. Rowdy, sometimes vulgar, always energetic, obsessed with crime and scandal and the small injustices of daily life. It was not respectable journalism, and that was precisely the point. But the Post alone was never going to be enough. What Murdoch wanted, what he had always wanted, was leverage at the highest levels of power. And leverage in America came from broadcasting, not from newspapers. Television was where the real reach existed, where messages could be shaped and delivered to millions simultaneously, where politicians had to go to communicate with voters, where wars could be won and lost in the hearts and minds of ordinary people watching their screens. There was a problem, however, a legal obstacle that had stood in his way since his early American ambitions. American broadcast law, developed in the post-war period and refined through decades of regulation, forbade foreign ownership of television stations. It was a protective measure, rooted in the belief that broadcasters wielded such power over the national conversation that they must be controlled by citizens, not aliens. The restriction was absolute and had the force of law behind it. And yet rules, Murdoch had learned through countless campaigns and negotiations, were not walls. They were, rather, conversations waiting to happen. In 1985, he became an American citizen. The decision was announced almost quietly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He renounced his Australian citizenship and his British citizenship simultaneously, and in that single gesture, he removed the legal barrier that had constrained him. He was no longer a foreign national. He was an American. And as an American, he could own television stations. As an American, he could build the last remaining piece of his empire. The transformation was swift, and to those watching from outside his world, almost dizzying. He acquired television stations in Chicago, Boston, Houston, Dallas, and Los Angeles, building a network of outlets that could speak to America's heartland and its coastal cities alike. And then, in 1986, he founded a fourth broadcast network, Fox, at a moment when the very idea seemed impossible. ABC, NBC, and CBS had divided American television between them for nearly 30 years. The notion that a newcomer could break that oligopoly seemed like the delusion of a man drunk on his own success. And yet Murdoch believed it could be done because he understood something that the old broadcasters did not, that television was changing, that cable was coming, that the audience was fragmenting, that people no longer wanted what was being given to them. The early years of Fox were difficult, even chaotic. The network burned through money at a rate that alarmed even his most loyal supporters. Stations affiliated with Fox were not prestigious. They were often the ones that had failed under previous ownership, the ones that no one else wanted. The programming was, by the standards of mainstream television, crude and loud. But there was something alive in it, something that connected with viewers who felt alienated by the stuffy formality of the older networks. And Murdoch was willing to lose money, year after year, because he was playing a much longer game. He was not building a network for the present moment. He was building a network for a future that he could already see approaching. What makes this period so strange to contemplate, from the vantage point of later decades, is how Murdoch seemed to move through American institutions with an almost frictionless ease. Politicians sought his endorsement. Businessmen wanted his alliance. He was a foreign-born outsider who had become, within a handful of years, one of the most influential media figures in American life. And the question that began to form, quietly and then with increasing insistence, was, how much power did one man actually have? How much influence could a single proprietor, controlling newspapers and television stations and now networks, actually wield over the beliefs and behaviors of a democracy? Could one voice, amplified through multiple channels, actually shape the political consciousness of a nation? These were not questions that Murdoch seemed to lose sleep over. If anything, they seemed to confirm what he had always believed, that the age of mass media belonged to those bold enough to seize it, and that history was written by men who acted while others debated the ethics of acting. By the 1990s, the machinery of the Murdoch empire had grown so vast and so intricate that it had begun to move almost of its own accord, less like a company and more like a living organism with its own hunger, its own instincts, its own need to expand and consume. Rupert himself, now in his 60s, occupied a peculiar position, simultaneously the most powerful man in his domain and increasingly a prisoner of the very systems he had constructed. He would wake in one city and fall asleep in another, his day an unbroken chain of decisions that rippled across continents, each one moving markets, shifting governments, altering the way millions of people understood their world. The Fox network, which he had launched in the United States in the 1980s, had by now become something he had not entirely foreseen. It was no longer simply a platform for his conservative ideals or a vehicle for profit, though it was certainly both of those things. It had become a kind of mirror held up to American anxieties, amplifying them, reshaping them, and in doing so, reshaping the nation itself. There is something almost dreamlike about watching power operate at this scale, the way a single man's vision, filtered through thousands of employees, millions of broadcast hours, and billions of dollars, can begin to shape the very contours of reality for entire populations. And yet this was precisely what was happening. His newspapers, meanwhile, remained his first love. They were older, more established, grounded in the physical reality of ink and paper. The Sun in Britain had become something of a national institution by the 1990s, not always beloved, certainly controversial, but undeniably powerful. The Times of London, which he had acquired in 1981, carried with it a gravitas and historical weight that even Rupert's seemingly limitless confidence found somewhat sobering. To own the Times was to hold in your hands not merely a newspaper, but a piece of British cultural identity. With that came both immense influence and immense responsibility, or so one might hope. Yet even as Rupert consolidated his power across these grand institutions, the seeds of fragmentation were already being sown, though few could see them at the time. His relationship with his son Lachlan had begun to take on a peculiar intensity. Lachlan was a different creature entirely from his father, born into wealth and power rather than having to claw toward it. He had grown up watching Rupert's ruthlessness, his willingness to crush competitors and bend regulations to his will, and something in Lachlan seemed to admire this while simultaneously finding it distasteful. It is a common pattern in dynastic families, this tension between admiration and revulsion, between wanting to inherit power and wanting to transcend the methods by which that power was won. By the early 1990s, Lachlan had begun inserting himself into the family business in more direct ways. He worked in various divisions, learning the machinery from the inside. But learning and agreeing are not the same thing, and Lachlan's tenure in various positions was marked by a certain friction. He seemed to want to do things differently, to operate with a modernism that his father, despite his own considerable adaptability to technological change, found somewhat bewildering. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from building an empire. The knowledge that the very structures you have created will eventually have to be handed over to someone else, to someone who will inevitably change them. Did Rupert experience this in those quiet moments? We can only speculate, but the question itself feels important to sit with for a moment. The 1990s were also a period when the nature of media itself was beginning to shift in ways that even Rupert, for all his foresight, did not fully grasp. The internet was emerging from the margins of academic and military use into something that ordinary people were beginning to encounter. It was slow, cumbersome, and most observers dismissed it as a fad, or at best a marginal technology that might develop some niche uses. Yet Rupert's instincts, honed by decades of reading the future of media before others could even perceive it, told him that something important was stirring here. He was not yet certain what it was or how to respond to it, but he was watching. He was always watching. In Britain, meanwhile, his ownership of the Times and the Sunday Times had given him something that transcended mere commercial advantage. It had given him what might be called soft power, the ability to shape narratives at the highest levels of political discourse. The editor of the Times occupied a peculiar position in British society, respected, consulted, feared by those in power. When Rupert appointed editors, or, more subtly, influenced editorial directions, he was shaping not just what people read, but how the entire British establishment understood itself. This was power of a different order entirely from ratings or revenue, and it was perhaps the power he valued most deeply, though he would never have admitted it in those terms. The business itself, though, was becoming more complex. In Australia, his home base, News Corporation, faced increasing regulatory scrutiny. The rules about media ownership were slowly being strengthened, attempts by governments to prevent any one individual or company from wielding too much power over the public sphere. Rupert had always operated with a kind of gentleman's agreement, understanding that the rules, while they existed, were somewhat flexible if one had the right connections and the right motivation. But as the 80s turned into the 90s, there was a shift. Regulators were becoming more aggressive, more principled about their enforcement. The cozy relationship between business power and political power that he had enjoyed for so long was becoming slightly more fraught. And yet, despite all these subtle pressures, all these hints that the world was changing in ways both predictable and unexpected, the Murdoch empire continued its expansion. It was not smooth or inevitable, but it was relentless. There is something almost hypnotic about watching a machine of this scale and complexity operate. The way it continues forward regardless of obstacles, the way it accumulates wealth and power with almost mathematical certainty. The men and women who worked within this machine, editors, executives, producers, reporters, they were living within a system that had its own logic, its own momentum. Some of them understood the nature of the machine they were serving. Others preferred not to look too closely at what they were part of. What strikes one, in retrospect, is how during this middle period of the 1990s, the empire appeared to outsiders to be at something like its apex. It was vast, profitable, influential, across multiple continents and multiple media formats. To those on the outside looking in, it seemed almost impregnable, almost permanent. Yet those closest to it, Rupert himself, his family, his most trusted lieutenants, could perhaps sense something else, a brittleness underneath the appearance of solidity, a certain fragility in the relationship between power and legitimacy that would, in the years to come, begin to crack in ways that no one could have fully predicted. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Murdoch had begun to recognize something that many empire builders come to understand only in their later years, that absolute control, once the obsession of youth and the weapon of ambition, becomes something far more complicated when you consider the shape of what comes after. His children were growing, they were watching. They were learning the language of power, not through apprenticeship in the traditional sense, but through observation, through dinners where billion-dollar decisions were discussed between the main course and dessert, through phone calls interrupted and resumed, through the quiet knowledge that their father's fingerprints were on something that touched millions of lives every single day. Lachlan, his eldest son with Anna Murdoch Mann, was perhaps the most obviously groomed for succession. Bright, ambitious in his own right, he moved through the business with a kind of inherited confidence, making decisions at Fox that bore his father's imprint, but also suggested an intelligence of his own. Yet there was something in Rupert that made him unable to fully cede authority, even to blood. It is a pattern we see repeated across family businesses and dynasties. The founder becomes so identified with the enterprise that the thought of its continuation without their active hand feels, on some level, like a kind of death. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, his daughter from his first marriage, had taken a quieter path. She had invested in production, in creative ventures, rather than in the raw machinery of distribution and control. And then there was James, the youngest, perhaps the least obviously suited to the cutthroat mathematics of the media business, yet possessed of a moral seriousness that would eventually put him at odds with many of his father's foundational choices. The empire itself, by this point, was a creature of almost incomprehensible scale. Sky Television in the United Kingdom, which Murdoch had built through years of perseverance and vast expenditure, had consolidated itself as a dominant force in European broadcasting. The satellite television wars had been brutal. Competitors had fallen away. Murdoch's willingness to absorb losses that would have bankrupted ordinary businessmen, losses that stretched into the hundreds of millions, had worn down rivals whose patience could not match his. In Australia, his grip on the newspaper industry was nearly absolute. In America, Fox had not merely survived, but had begun to thrive, and the network was starting to reshape American political discourse in ways that were still, at that moment, only half visible to the broader culture. It was during this period that questions about the nature of Murdoch's influence began to take on a particular texture. There was a growing awareness, in boardrooms and in the corridors of Parliament, that his media holdings were not simply commercial enterprises competing in an open market. They were, many observers were beginning to argue, instruments of power that operated according to their own logic. answerable ultimately to the whims and convictions of a single individual. When Murdoch wanted something, a political outcome, a regulatory change, the advancement of a particular narrative, his newspapers had a way of speaking in unison. His television stations, in their editorial decisions and in what they chose to emphasize or ignore, seemed to move in concert. Some would argue this was simple editorial consistency. Others, increasingly, began to wonder if it represented something more troubling, a form of influence that operated outside the normal mechanisms of democratic accountability. Because unlike a corporation beholden to multiple shareholders and a board of directors with competing interests, Murdoch's holdings, through a careful architecture of ownership and control, remained fundamentally his. He could decide, he could change course, he could pursue vendettas or advance crusades, and the machinery of his empire would align accordingly. In Britain, there began to emerge troubling reports about the methods by which his papers obtained information. The News of the World, that tabloid property that had been so successful in penetrating the lives and secrets of the famous and the infamous, was beginning to face allegations about phone hacking, the notion that journalists were illegally accessing voicemail and private communications to build their stories. These allegations were still emerging in fragments, not yet assembled into the comprehensive scandal that would eventually consume so much of Murdoch's attention and legacy. But the seeds were there, growing in the dark soil beneath the visible structure of the empire. Meanwhile, in America, Fox News had begun its transformation from a cable news network trying to establish itself into something far more consequential. Rupert Murdoch had brought in Roger Ailes, a television executive with deep conservative credentials and a vision for news programming that would, he believed, counterbalance what he saw as the liberal bias of the mainstream media. Whether this assertion was true or whether it was a marketing genius stroke became, itself, a question that divided the nation. What was undeniable was that Fox News began to cultivate a particular audience, to speak to grievances and concerns that the other networks seemed to ignore or dismiss, and in doing so, it began to build a constituency for itself that was intensely loyal and increasingly inseparable from a particular vision of American identity and politics. The late 1990s brought with them the kind of prosperity that seemed, to many observers of that era, to be permanent. The internet was beginning to reshape commerce and communication, but Murdoch, with his newspaper and television interests, seemed to have the resources and the influence to adapt, to leverage his existing assets into this new landscape. He acquired stakes in online ventures. He began to position News Corporation as a company that straddled the old world of traditional media and the emerging world of digital connectivity. And yet, even as the empire expanded and consolidated its reach, there were beginning to form in the shadows the forces that would eventually test it, reshape it, and in ways both subtle and dramatic, alter the course of Murdoch's life and the lives of his children. The tensions between old media and new, between journalistic ethics and commercial ambition, between the desire for privacy and the hunger for knowledge, these tensions were building, accumulating, preparing to express themselves in ways that no amount of wealth or influence could entirely control or contain. The groundwork for future reckoning was being laid, quietly, almost invisibly, even as the visible structure of the Murdoch empire reached toward its zenith. By the early 1980s, Rupert Murdoch had begun to sense a shift in the terrain around him. The world was changing in ways that newspapers alone could not contain. Television had moved from curiosity to dominance, from luxury to necessity in almost every household across the developed world. And Murdoch, who had spent his entire career building newspapers into instruments of influence, began to wonder what might happen if he could control not just what people read, but what they watched, when they watched it, and how the images arrived in their homes. The acquisition of Sky Television in Britain represented something far larger than a simple business calculation. It was a philosophical repositioning, For decades, Murdoch had wielded power through the printed word, through headlines that could shape a morning, through editorials that could nudge a nation's thinking. But television offered something more immediate, more intimate, more pervasive. A newspaper sat on a table and waited to be picked up. Television entered the room as a companion, as a voice in the darkness, as a presence that families invited into their most private moments. What if, Murdoch began to consider, he could own that presence? Sky's journey was not a simple ascent, though. The costs were staggering. The infrastructure required to beam signals across the British landscape, to compete with the established broadcasters who had held their monopoly for generations, it demanded capital, persistence, and a willingness to lose money year after year in service of a vision that many people thought was naive or even delusional. Murdoch poured hundreds of millions of pounds into the venture. Shareholders grew restless. Analysts questioned his sanity. But there is something in the temperament of certain ambitious men that allows them to see past immediate failure toward a distant victory that remains visible only to them. The battles were fierce, not just in the marketplace but in the political and regulatory spheres. Britain's establishment, the old guard of broadcasting, the traditionalists who believed that television was too powerful a medium to be left in private hands, especially in hands like Murdoch's, fought against Sky's expansion with every tool at their disposal. Licenses were contested, regulations were tightened. Questions were raised in Parliament about whether this Australian-born mogul, this builder of tabloids, this man whose papers had become synonymous with sensation and aggression, should be permitted to control so much of what Britain's people could see and hear. Yet there was a peculiar irony in these objections. The very people who feared Murdoch's influence most were often those who had underestimated him most consistently. They saw the tabloid publisher, the sensationalist, the man who had made his fortune by understanding the appetites of ordinary people. They failed to see the strategic thinker, the investor willing to absorb catastrophic losses, the individual who could hold contradictory ideas in his mind simultaneously. That is, that the masses wanted sensation and entertainment and scandal, yes, but also that they wanted convenience, value, and the feeling of being part of something new and progressive. By the late 80s, Sky had begun to stabilize. The wounds from the initial investment period had not closed, but they had stopped bleeding so profusely. The infrastructure was in place. The subscriber base, while still modest compared to traditional broadcasters, was growing. And Murdoch had discovered something that would become fundamental to his understanding of modern media. The most powerful control is not always the loudest voice, but the one that reaches into the home most regularly and most intimately. This was a crucial evolution in his thinking, though perhaps he did not articulate it in quite these terms. In newspapers, Murdoch had competed on the basis of immediate impact, the story that dominated breakfast conversation, the headline that became the subject of argument at the pub that evening. Newspapers were daily events, intense but episodic. Television, or at least subscription television, could be something more continuous, more woven into the fabric of daily life. A subscriber to Sky was not simply buying a product, they were buying a habit, a routine, a relationship. The consolidation of power in television raised different questions than newspapers did, though many of the same critics seemed not to realize this distinction. When you own a newspaper, you control what appears on the front page, what stories are covered, what voices are heard. But the reader still maintains a kind of agency. They can choose to read something else, or choose not to read at all. Television, particularly subscription television, creates a different kind of relationship. The viewer makes a choice to subscribe, yes, but once they have done so, the flow of content becomes almost invisible. It arrives as a stream. It becomes background, companion, authority. Murdoch grasped this intuitively, if not always consciously. He understood that Sky needed not just to survive, but to become an essential utility in British homes. And for that to happen, it needed to offer something that terrestrial television could not. Here again, he was willing to make enormous financial commitments, spending vast sums to acquire the rights to broadcast sports, particularly football, which had become something close to a religion in Britain. Sports rights were expensive, but they also created necessity. If you wanted to watch your team play, if you wanted access to the matches that mattered most to you and your family, you would need Sky. It was a form of leverage that traditional broadcasters, constrained by public service obligations and more modest budgets, could not easily match. And as the 1990s approached, Sky began to move from the margins into something closer to the center of British media life. The victory was not yet complete. Indeed, one might argue that the battle continues to this day, but the trajectory had become clear to those who were paying attention. By the late 1990s, something began to shift beneath the surface of the Murdoch empire, a tremor that would eventually reshape the entire structure he had spent decades building. The family dynamics, once defined by a clear patriarchal vision, started to crack under the weight of succession planning and the emerging voices of the next generation. Rupert had always maintained absolute control, the unquestioned architect of every major decision. But as he moved into his 60s and then beyond, the question of what would happen when he was no longer at the helm began to occupy boardrooms and family dinners alike. James, the youngest son, represented something different from his older siblings. He was born during a time when his father's influence was already sprawling across continents, when News Corporation had become not simply a media company, but a force that shaped political discourse and cultural narratives across multiple nations. James grew up in an environment saturated with his father's power and philosophy, yet he seemed to possess a questioning sensibility that set him apart. He watched his father's methods, the aggressive acquisition strategies, the willingness to push ethical boundaries in pursuit of market dominance, and he did not always approve in the way that had been expected. This internal tension within a single family would eventually become a fault line that would crack the entire edifice. During these years, Fox News had solidified its position as a pillar of American conservative media. Launched in 1996, with the vision of providing what Murdoch and Roger Ailes called a platform with a distinctly different perspective from the mainstream outlets, Fox News grew with remarkable velocity. It became not merely a news channel but a cultural force, shaping how millions of Americans understood politics, policy, and current events. The network's approach was deliberate, combining entertainment sensibility with news gathering, mixing opinion programs with reporting in a way that blurred the traditional boundaries between journalism and advocacy. Whether one viewed this as a necessary corrective to perceived bias in other outlets, or as a troubling erosion of journalistic standards, depended largely on one's political perspective, and therein lay its power. Yet alongside this commercial success and political influence, there were warning signs that few in the upper echelons of the organization seemed willing to seriously confront. The standards by which News Corporation operated, the competitive ruthlessness that had made it successful, the tolerance for crossing lines that other media organizations would not cross, these practices created a culture that would eventually breed scandal. In Britain particularly, the tabloid newspapers that formed such a crucial part of Murdoch's original empire operated in an environment of increasingly aggressive journalism. The News of the World, that storied Sunday tabloid that had been part of the Murdoch portfolio since 1969, exemplified both the commercial brilliance and the ethical vulnerability of the organization. The British press had always operated differently from the American model. Without constitutional protections equivalent to the First Amendment, British journalists and publishers operated within a framework that gave them certain freedoms but also exposed them to different legal risks. The sensationalism that characterized British tabloids was legendary. celebrated for breaking stories and entertaining millions of readers each week. But this same sensationalism created pressure on journalists to find stories, to push boundaries, to do whatever was necessary to remain ahead of competitors. Within this competitive hothouse, the line between aggressive reporting and illegal activity could become disturbingly thin. Rupert Murdoch's presence in Britain had always been somewhat different from his operations in Australia or America. He had acquired his British holdings as a relatively young man still building his empire, and over the decades he became something of a fixture in British media and politics. Politicians across the spectrum sought his favour, understanding that his support could help shape electoral outcomes and public opinion. Prime ministers from both Labour and Conservative parties cultivated relationships with him. His influence was not merely commercial but political, woven into the fabric of British public life in ways that were perhaps more visible and more explicitly acknowledged than in other nations where he operated. The growth of News Corporation had created an organizational structure of almost staggering complexity. The company operated across multiple countries, in multiple languages, through subsidiaries and holding companies that often obscured the ultimate chain of command. This complexity, whether intentionally designed or simply the inevitable result of rapid growth, created pockets within the organization where accountability could be diffused, where isolated decisions could be made without immediate visibility to senior leadership. Or so the argument would later be made. Whether that complexity was a shield behind which misconduct could hide, or whether it was merely an excuse for leadership to claim ignorance about what was happening in parts of their own organization, remained a subject of considerable debate. During the first decade of the 21st century, as the internet began to transform media consumption and traditional print journalism faced declining revenues, the Murdoch empire faced new pressures. Newspapers that had once been reliably profitable were struggling. Television remained strong, but the traditional dominance of broadcast networks was beginning to fragment. News Corporation had to evolve, to find new revenue streams, to compete in a rapidly changing technological landscape. It was in this environment of pressure and transformation that corners were cut with increasing frequency, that the protective walls around the organization began to weaken, and that practices that had long existed in grey zones began to attract attention from those who were willing to look closely. Consider the perspective of someone working within the news of the world during these years. If you were a journalist or editor there, you existed within an organizational culture shaped by decades of success, built on sensational stories and competitive intensity. Your editor would be under pressure from above to sell newspapers, to beat competitors, to find stories that would capture the public imagination. The financial rewards of success were real, and the consequences of failure were immediate and visible. In such an environment, the abstract ethical principles that journalism schools teach can seem to recede, replaced by the immediate pressures of survival and success within the competitive ecosystem you inhabit. The phone hacking scandal that would eventually engulf the Murdoch empire did not emerge suddenly or without warning. It developed gradually, like a story being revealed one page at a time, with early chapters easy to dismiss or ignore until the full scope of what had occurred became impossible to deny. The practice itself, using technical means to access private communications without authorization, had apparently been happening for years, a clandestine tool deployed by journalists and private investigators in the service of getting stories that competitors could not access. It was secret, contained within a relatively small circle, and protected by walls of silence that had held for longer than anyone at the top of the organization would later admit. By the early 2000s, Rupert Murdoch had assembled something that few media moguls in history had ever managed to hold together, a genuine empire that spanned continents and touched nearly every form of mass communication. But empires, as anyone who has studied power and human nature might notice, contain within them the seeds of their own transformation, and sometimes that transformation arrives not through external forces, but through the very machinery that keeps them running. The News Corporation that existed in the years after Murdoch's acquisition of Fox had become almost impossibly complex. There were newspapers in 3 countries, there was film, there was television broadcasting across multiple continents, there was the growing satellite television empire, and underneath all of it, there was an operating philosophy that had remained largely consistent since his earliest days in Adelaide. The idea that editorial control and business power could be wielded as a single instrument. That newspapers were not merely commercial enterprises, but channels through which a proprietor's view of the world could be distributed to millions. This philosophy, it should be said, was not unique to Murdoch, but the scale at which he practiced it was. When Murdoch intervened in editorial decisions, and the historical record shows he did so regularly, he was not simply making suggestions to distant editors. He was exerting influence over outlets that collectively shaped the political and cultural conversation in major democracies. The power was real. The reach was real. And the question of whether such concentration of media ownership in one person's hands served the public interest had begun by this point to trouble many observers. What's worth noting here is that Murdoch himself seemed largely unbothered by such concerns. He had built his empire on the conviction that he understood audiences better than anyone else, that he had an intuition for what the public wanted to read, watch, and believe. Whether this was genuine insight or a form of self-deception is perhaps unknowable, but what is clear is that this conviction shaped every major decision he made. It was the foundation upon which his most aggressive moves were built. In the early 1990s, Murdoch began to see new opportunities in broadcasting that he felt compelled to pursue. The regulatory environment in the United States, which had long restricted foreign ownership of television stations, seemed to be loosening. Telecommunications law was evolving, and Murdoch, recognizing that the future of media lay not in print alone, but in the convergence of television, satellite, and digital technologies, made the decision to become an American citizen. This was not a trivial choice. It meant surrendering his Australian citizenship, the connection to his origins. But it allowed him to own broadcast television stations in the United States, and that regulatory freedom seemed worth the sacrifice. The transformation of Murdoch into an American citizen in 1985, for that is when the process was completed, marked a subtle but significant shift in how he positioned himself. He was no longer primarily an Australian publisher or British proprietor who happened to own some American assets. He was now explicitly a player in the American media landscape, subject to its regulations, answerable to its shareholders, and increasingly focused on the American market as the engine of his empire's growth. It was as if he had repositioned himself at the center of the world's largest and most influential media ecosystem. During this same period, something else was happening that would prove to have profound consequences. Murdoch's first wife, Patricia, had died in 1988. His second marriage, to Anna Delphina Laura Murdoch, was the mother of his 3 youngest children, Elizabeth, James, and Lachlan. And as Murdoch moved through his late 50s and into his 60s, the question of succession began to weigh more heavily, even if he was not yet ready to explicitly confront it. Who would inherit this empire? How would it be divided? What kind of leadership would preserve and grow what he had built? These are the kinds of questions that wealthy dynasties have grappled with for centuries. The challenge of passing concentrated power from one generation to the next, while maintaining its coherence and vitality. There is something almost universal about the pattern. A founder builds something through force of will and singular vision, and then, inevitably, that founder must eventually release control. The transition is rarely smooth, the vision rarely remains uncontested, and the relationships within the family, strained by the weight of these decisions, sometimes fracture under the pressure. Murdoch, by all accounts, was deeply invested in the idea of building a dynasty that would outlast him. He had not spent decades accumulating power and influence simply to see it dispersed or dismantled after his death. And so, as he entered the 1990s, he began subtly shifting the structure of his empire to position his children for eventual leadership. Lachlan, his oldest child with Anna, began to appear more frequently in the inner circles of News Corporation decision-making. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had shown less interest in the family business and was pursuing her own career in television production. And James, the youngest, was still finding his way. But even as Murdoch began this gradual preparation for succession, there remained a fundamental tension at the heart of his empire. The media outlets he controlled, particularly the newspapers in Britain and Australia, wielded political influence that was almost impossible to quantify with precision. Governments paid attention to what Murdoch's papers said, politicians sought his endorsement, and occasionally, journalists and observers began to ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between media power and democratic accountability. If one man, through his control of major newspapers, could shape the political narrative in a country, then what did that mean for the health of democratic institutions? These questions, posed by media critics and academic observers, were never answered to anyone's complete satisfaction. Murdoch continued to operate on the assumption that his ownership of major media outlets gave him the right to exercise editorial influence, and journalists who worked for him, for the most part, adapted to his preferences and his vision. Some came to see him as a visionary who understood his audience. Others viewed him more skeptically, as a powerful figure who used his outlets to serve his own business and political interests. The truth, as is often the case with complex figures and complex systems, likely contained elements of both perspectives. What is undeniable is that by the 1990s, Murdoch's influence had become woven into the fabric of political and cultural life in multiple countries. The question of how one person could wield such power, and whether democratic societies should allow such concentrations of media ownership to exist, remained largely unresolved. And it is a question that would become increasingly urgent as the century progressed and as technological change began to alter the landscape of media itself in unexpected and profound ways. By the early 2000s, the architecture of Murdoch's power had begun to show its first real fractures. Not because the empire was weakening, quite the contrary. Fox News was becoming a cultural force that rivaled, and in many quarters surpassed, the reach of the established networks. The Wall Street Journal was under his ownership, reshaping the landscape of American financial journalism. Yet all of this expansion, this relentless acquisition and consolidation, had set in motion something far more destabilizing than any external threat. It had created, within the family itself, a question that would grow louder with each passing year. Who, precisely, would inherit this vast machinery when Rupert Murdoch could no longer hold the reins? This question might have seemed straightforward in earlier decades. Rupert had sons. Lachlan was the eldest, born in 1964, and James, born a decade later, in 1972. There was also Elizabeth, his daughter, often called Liz, who had proven herself a capable executive. In traditional terms, the line of succession should have been clear, and yet succession in the Murdoch family was never a matter of simple primogeniture. It was, instead, a complex dance of capability, temperament, and Rupert's own evolving vision of what leadership meant. Lachlan, the eldest son, had grown up in the shadow of his father's towering ambitions. As a young man, he'd shown promise in the business, sharp-eyed, strategic, with an instinct for the market that suggested he might one day step into his father's considerable shoes. But relationships within the family had never been simple. Rupert's marriages had fractured, reformed, and fractured again. With each divorce came new configurations of affection and suspicion, new alignments of interest. The children from different marriages didn't always see eye to eye. Lachlan, from Rupert's first marriage to Patricia Booker, sometimes found himself in a different position than James and Elizabeth, whose mothers came later. And then there was the matter of Rupert's temperament. He was not a man who easily relinquished control. The idea of a smooth, planned transition, with him stepping gracefully into emeritus status while his chosen heir took the helm, seemed almost laughably at odds with everything he'd ever done. He had built this empire through sheer force of will, through ruthlessness, through an ability to sense weakness and exploit it. The notion that he might one day hand it all over and simply watch felt fundamentally wrong to him. In 2003, something significant happened. Lachlan stepped away from the day-to-day operations at Fox News and News Corporation. The circumstances were murky, filtered through press releases and diplomatic language. Some said he'd wanted to pursue his own ventures. Others suggested a rift had opened between father and son, disagreements about strategy, about the direction of the company, about who truly had the authority to make major decisions. Whatever the precise catalyst, his departure sent a shockwave through the organization. If Lachlan couldn't bridge the gap between his ambitions and his father's, what did that mean for the succession at large? James, the younger son, began to assume a more prominent role. He was different from his brother in temperament, perhaps more willing to align himself with his father's vision, or perhaps simply more comfortable in a supporting position. He rose through the ranks, taking on significant responsibilities at Sky Italia, at various News Corporation divisions. But his ascent carried its own complications. In the minds of some observers, there was a sense that James was being elevated, partly because he was more malleable, more likely to implement his father's wishes without too much pushback. Was he rising on genuine merit, or was he being positioned as a more compliant alternative to his more independent-minded older brother? Meanwhile, Elizabeth had carved out her own path. She'd moved away from the direct orbit of her father's empire, establishing herself as a producer and executive in her own right. She'd founded her own production company, had success in television and film. Her distance from the main operation suggested a kind of wisdom, a recognition, perhaps, that the family business came with enormous burdens and that there might be other ways to build a meaningful life and legacy. Yet her absence from the succession race was itself telling. The Murdoch empire, despite its global reach and cultural power, seemed to be operating under an assumption that a woman, even one accomplished and capable, might not be the obvious custodian of the whole thing. What's striking, when you think about the Murdoch dynasty during this period, is how little of this internal turmoil showed on the surface. To the outside world, News Corporation continued its expansion. Murdoch himself, now in his 70s, seemed as energetic and acquisitive as ever. The acquisitions kept coming, the influence kept spreading, and yet, within the family, there was a growing sense that something had to give. The empire had been built by a single visionary, a man with an almost preternatural ability to sense where power was shifting in the media landscape, and to position himself to capture it. Could it survive the transition to a second generation? Could a leadership structure, necessarily more collegial, more bound by corporate governance, more diluted, maintain the momentum that Rupert had created? These weren't idle questions. They touched on something fundamental about how family enterprises work, how power actually transfers, how the force of a single personality can so thoroughly animate an institution that the institution itself becomes almost inseparable from that person. Murdoch had always said he wanted to build something that would last, but lasting, it seemed, required either finding an heir who could replicate his abilities, an unlikely prospect, given how singular those abilities were, or fundamentally restructuring the organization itself. And restructuring meant, almost by definition, a loss of the very thing that had made it extraordinary in the first place, the unchallenged authority of a single mind. In the background, barely visible to most observers, There were other shifts too. The media landscape itself was beginning to change. The internet, which had seemed for years like a curiosity, a supplement to traditional media, was starting to reshape fundamental assumptions about how information moved, how people consumed it, what value could be extracted from content. Murdoch had always been quick to spot these transitions, to position himself ahead of the curve. But now he was in his 70s. The question wasn't just who would lead the Murdoch empire, but whether the very concept of a Murdoch empire as it had been configured would even remain relevant. By the time the 21st century arrived, Murdoch's grip on power had become something almost architectural in its complexity. The empire did not simply own newspapers or television stations anymore. It had woven itself into the sinews of democratic institutions across continents. And yet, for someone who had spent his entire life building, consolidating, and expanding, there emerged a peculiar restlessness. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the erosion of the very authority he had spent decades constructing. Perhaps it was both, moving in subtle tandem. The phone hacking scandal that would eventually engulf News Corporation did not arrive as a sudden storm. It emerged instead like fog rolling across a moor, almost imperceptibly at first, then slowly, inexorably consuming everything in its path. What had begun as whispers in the corridors of British journalism, rumours that reporters at the News of the World, the Sunday tabloid that Murdoch had owned and cherished for decades, were intercepting private voicemails, became, by the early 2010s, a torrent of confession and revelation that threatened to dismantle the entire enterprise. The irony, had Murdoch possessed the temperament to appreciate it, would have been profound. The man who had built his fortune on the premise that nothing was sacred, that the public had a right to know everything about everyone, now found that same principle applied with merciless symmetry to his own organization. Reporters had hacked into the phones of celebrities, politicians, members of the royal family, and most damningly, victims of crime. They had listened to the private conversations of a young girl named Millie Dowler, while her parents desperately searched for her after she had gone missing. This was not journalism, even by the elastic standards Murdoch had long established. This was invasion, at its most naked and most shameful. As the investigations deepened, as arrests multiplied and trials began their slow procession through the courts, Murdoch found himself in a position of extraordinary vulnerability. He was 80 years old. His health, though still robust enough to permit him continued executive authority, was no longer the reliable instrument it had been. And the institutions he had built, News Corporation, News International in Britain, the sprawling American empire anchored by Fox News, faced an existential threat. Advertisers began to withdraw from the tainted tabloid. Political allies who had courted his favor for decades suddenly discovered urgent reasons to distance themselves from his enterprises. What unfolded in this period was a kind of unraveling that no one, perhaps not even Murdoch himself, could have fully anticipated. The man who had seemed invincible, who had weathered regulatory storms and political opposition and technological disruption through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance, now confronted something far more difficult to combat: the revelation of institutional corruption bearing his personal imprint. The closure of the News of the World in 2011 stands as a symbolic moment that echoes still. The paper had existed since 1843. It had been, at various points in its history, sensationalist and genuinely investigative, salacious and occasionally important. Murdoch had owned it for decades, had shaped it in his image, had made it into a powerhouse of circulation and influence. And now, to save his broader empire from the reputational contagion spreading outward, he made the decision to shut it down entirely. 168 years of publication, gone. The decision was, in its way, an admission. Not of guilt precisely. Murdoch has never conceded guilt in any meaningful sense, but of necessity. The vessel had become too damaged to remain afloat. The British public, watching this unfold through news reports and parliamentary inquiries and court proceedings, experienced something akin to a revelation of their own. The cozy relationship between media power and political authority, which had seemed almost natural, almost inevitable, was suddenly exposed as something more sinister. Murdoch had dined with prime ministers. His editors had reported directly to his preferences. His newspapers had shaped elections, influenced policy, and operated with a presumption of immunity that now appeared not just arrogant, but actively criminal. And yet, and this is perhaps the most difficult truth to hold, some of this influence had been granted, even welcomed, by the very political class now expressing shock at its existence. In the United States, Murdoch's position appeared, superficially, to be more secure. Fox News remained extraordinarily profitable and influential. Its political sympathies aligned with a significant portion of the American electorate. There were no equivalent phone hacking investigations threatening American operations, and yet, even here, the taint of the scandal could not be entirely contained. Questions began to be asked about the culture Murdoch had fostered in his organizations, about whether the ruthlessness that had built his empire had also bred a certain ethical carelessness, a willingness to cut corners that could metastasize into genuine criminality. The dynasty, as Murdoch had constructed it, had been predicated on a particular vision of power. The media, in this view, was not a neutral observer of events, but an active participant in shaping reality. Those who controlled the media controlled the narrative. Those who controlled the narrative wielded extraordinary influence over the public imagination and the political process itself. This was not a hidden philosophy. Murdoch had always been explicit about it, or at least as explicit as powerful people generally permit themselves to be in public. But the phone hacking scandal made the implications of this vision suddenly and unavoidably visible. And as the investigations continued, as more details emerged about who had known what and when they had known it, Murdoch faced a question that perhaps no entrepreneur ever fully anticipates until it arrives. What does one do when the very mechanisms of power that have sustained you become liabilities? When the loyalty of lieutenants begins to waver? When the presumption of authority that has protected you for decades suddenly evaporates? These were not questions with obvious answers. His son James, who had been positioned as his successor, now found himself at the center of the storm. Had James known about the hacking? To what extent had he participated in the cover-up? These inquiries led to his own resignation from major positions within the organization and, perhaps more significantly, to a rupture in the relationship between father and son that would have reverberations for years to come. The succession plan, which had seemed so carefully orchestrated, began to fray at its seams. By the time Rupert Murdoch entered his 8th decade, the empire he had constructed had begun to show the first visible fractures, not from external assault, but from the weight of its own contradictions. The phone hacking scandal, which had erupted in the British press with such violence around 2011, had shaken the very foundations of his news corporation in ways that even his formidable will could not entirely repair. And yet, as is often the case with men who have spent their entire lives building monuments to their own vision, he could not simply step away. The question that haunted the inner circles of News Corp wasn't whether he would leave, but rather how and to whom. In the years following the closure of the News of the World, that tabloid that had served as his flagship for decades, sacrificed on the altar of damage control, Murdoch had engineered a split. News Corporation, that unwieldy colossus that contained both his publishing interests and his television networks, was divided into two entities. There was 21st Century Fox, which would hold the entertainment and broadcasting properties, the television stations, the film studios, the cultural machinery that had made him so extraordinarily influential in shaping what billions of people watched. And then there was News Corp proper, a leaner animal, focused on the publishing side, the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, the Sunday Times, and the various other mastheads that represented the written legacy of his dominion. Some observers, perhaps generously, suggested this was a strategic repositioning. Others whispered that it was a deliberate separation of the jewels from the liabilities. The thing about empire building, though, is that it rarely concludes neatly. The men who build them do not simply hand them over to history and retire to some quiet pastoral estate. Instead, they linger, they advise, they interfere, they reshape their organizations in their image even from the margins, even as they ostensibly withdraw. And Murdoch, despite his advancing years, showed little inclination to behave differently. His children, meanwhile, had begun to develop their own trajectories within the family enterprise. James Murdoch, his younger son with Wendy Deng Murdoch, had for years been positioned as a potential heir, intelligent, media-savvy, fluent in the language of digital technology and corporate nuance. He had run Sky Italia, the Italian pay television business, and had been groomed, it seemed, for larger responsibilities. Yet James's inheritance of his father's empire was never guaranteed, nor was it universally desired within the family itself. His older half-siblings, Lachlan and Elizabeth, had their own claims, their own visions for what the Murdoch enterprise should become. A family business, after all, is simply that, a business conducted by family members, and families, as anyone who has ever navigated one can attest, are rarely harmonious. Lachlan Murdoch, the eldest son from Rupert's first marriage to Patricia Booker, had once seemed destined to inherit. He had worked alongside his father, learning the brutal economics of media ownership, the politics of influence, the art of consolidation. Yet at a certain point in the late 2000s, Lachlan had stepped back, ostensibly to pursue other interests. Some said it was a choice. Others suggested that the intensity of working so closely alongside Rupert Murdoch, a man whose competitive instincts had never dimmed, whose need for control remained absolute, had simply proven unsustainable. The family dynamics here are worth pausing on for a moment. What does it mean to work in an organization where your father is not merely your boss, but the founder, the ideological center, the final authority on all major decisions? What compromises accumulate over time? Elizabeth Murdoch, the only daughter among Rupert's older children, had charted a different course entirely. She had become a television producer of considerable accomplishment, building Shine Limited into a successful production company that created content for broadcast around the world. Unlike her brothers, she had chosen to distance herself from the direct operations of the Murdoch media empire, though the distance was geographical and professional rather than emotional or financial. She maintained a significant stake in the family's fortunes, but she built her own legacy separately. One could argue, without too much romantic license, that she found a kind of peace in that separation that her brothers did not. The succession question, then, was never as simple as identifying the most competent son. It was bound up with family history, with the particular character and ambitions of each child, with the ways in which proximity to Rupert Murdoch either energized or exhausted those around him. And as the 2010s progressed, as the phone hacking scandal receded slightly in the public consciousness, though its legal and reputational consequences continued to unfold, the media world began to wonder who would eventually hold the keys to this immense apparatus of influence. There was also the matter of Murdoch's marriages and the shifting alliances that accompanied them. His third wife, Wendy Deng, represented a dramatic departure from his previous choices. She was much younger, Chinese-American, and brought with her a different set of international connections and sensibilities. The marriage had produced children, Grace and Chloe, whose place in the succession hierarchy remained ambiguous. His fourth marriage, to Jerry Hall, herself a figure of some notoriety from her modeling career and her marriage to Mick Jagger, was brief and ended in divorce, and by that point he had already married for a fifth time, to Jerry Hall's successor in his affections. Each marriage, each relationship, seemed to generate new questions about inheritance and legitimacy and the future shape of the empire. What one begins to perceive, as the layers of this story deepen, is that the Murdoch empire was never simply a business enterprise that could be passed down like a country estate or a collection of artworks. It was an expression of Rupert Murdoch's personality, his ambitions, his particular understanding of what media should do and how it should function in society. The question of succession was ultimately the question of whether the empire could survive its founder, and if so, in what form. Would it become something else entirely? Would it fragment? Would one of his children finally assert enough authority to remake it in their own image, or would it forever bear the fingerprints of the man who had built it, even long after he had passed from the scene? These are questions that have no easy answers, and they occupied the thoughts of journalists, analysts, and competitors throughout the 2010s, as Murdoch aged and as the world around his empire changed in ways both obvious and subtle. By the time Rupert Murdoch turned his attention to the digital revolution that was reshaping the entire landscape of media and information, his empire had already endured decades of transformation, scandal, and the kind of relentless expansion that had become almost second nature to him. The Internet, emerging in the late 1990s and accelerating through the early 2000s, represented something almost unprecedented in his career, a disruption he could not simply buy his way into dominance, nor easily control through editorial muscle alone. The digital age moved at a different rhythm, with different rules, and with power distributed among millions of voices rather than concentrated in newsrooms and boardrooms where Murdoch had always felt most comfortable. News Corporation, the parent company that held together the sprawling constellation of newspapers, television networks, and film studios, began to grapple with what everyone in the industry was grappling with: how to maintain relevance and profitability when the very foundations of media distribution were shifting beneath them. The question that haunted media executives wasn't whether the internet would change everything, but rather how quickly it would happen and who would survive the transformation intact. For Murdoch, who had spent his entire adult life learning to adapt, to pivot, to see opportunity where others saw only threat, this moment presented yet another frontier. But the digital transformation would prove different from his previous reinventions in ways that perhaps even he underestimated. The launch of Fox News in 1996, just as the web was beginning to capture the imagination of mainstream audiences, had positioned Murdoch at the center of a new kind of media power, one rooted not in the universality of a newspaper's reach, but in the intensity of a partisan audience's loyalty. Cable news networks operated on a fundamentally different business model than the old broadcast networks or newspapers. They needed constant content, constant input, constant reasons for viewers to tune in and remain engaged. The format rewarded sensation, opinion, and the cultivation of what might be called a tribe of devoted viewers who returned again and again because they felt understood, validated, and entertained by the lens through which events were being presented to them. This model would prove remarkably lucrative and durable, even as traditional media burned away around it like paper in flame. Yet the internet represented something that television, even cable television, could not entirely contain. It was decentralized. It was participatory. People weren't simply receiving information anymore. They were also creating it, sharing it, debating it in forums and early social networks that existed beyond anyone's editorial control. The blogosphere, as it came to be known, represented millions of amateur journalists, critics, and commentators, all operating simultaneously, often with greater authenticity and specificity than the polished productions of major news organizations. How does a man who has built an empire on controlling the flow of information adapt to a world where information flows in all directions at once, where the barrier to entry is simply a computer and an internet connection? The answer, for Murdoch, came partly through acquisition and partly through a kind of strategic patience. News Corporation invested in digital properties, acquired stakes in profitable internet ventures, and attempted to build digital editions of its newspapers that would somehow generate revenue in an environment where readers had grown accustomed to free content online. The Wall Street Journal, one of the crown jewels of the Murdoch empire, became one of the earliest newspapers to successfully implement a paywall, a digital subscription model that suggested readers might actually pay for premium, curated journalism, even in the age of infinite free information. Whether this presaged the future of news or represented merely an exception to a rule that would eventually swallow all traditional media became a question that defined the early 21st century. But there was something else happening beneath the surface of these business decisions and strategic pivots, something that would eventually come to define not just Murdoch's legacy, but the relationship between media power and public trust in ways that echoed far beyond his corporate offices. The phone hacking scandal that erupted in the UK in the late 2000s, beginning with revelations that journalists and private investigators working for the News of the World had been illegally accessing the voicemail messages of celebrities, politicians, and crime victims, represented perhaps the most significant crisis Murdoch's empire had ever faced. Not a market shift, not a competitor's success, but a fundamental breach of public trust rooted in the aggressive, boundary-pushing culture that had been cultivated within his most profitable and influential publications. The News of the World, that scrappy, sensationalist British tabloid that had been the proving ground for so many of Murdoch's early innovations, had been simultaneously celebrated for breaking major stories and criticized for its willingness to resort to questionable methods to obtain them. The phone hacking scandal revealed that this criticism was not merely about editorial judgment or the pursuit of salacious stories, but about systematic illegality, about the exploitation of grieving families, about a culture in which the pursuit of stories had metastasized into something darker and more predatory. When it became clear that the hacking had been more widespread than initially admitted, that senior editors may have known about it, that perhaps even executives at higher levels had been aware of or condoned the practice, the political and legal consequences began to cascade in ways that threatened the entire Murdoch enterprise. The arrest and prosecution of journalists and editors, the closure of the News of the World after 168 years of publication, the parliamentary inquiries into media practices and ethics, the revelations of payments to victims and to officials, all of this unfolded as a kind of slow-motion reckoning with the empire's own methods. For a man who had always believed that the ends justified the means, that aggressive journalism was simply the cost of discovering truth and holding power accountable, the suggestion that his organization had crossed clear legal and ethical lines was not merely a business crisis, but perhaps a more fundamental challenge to the narrative he had told himself about his life's work. Can a media empire built on the promise of telling important truths endure when those who run it are revealed to have systematically violated the rights and privacy of ordinary people in pursuit of those stories? And so we arrive at the place where empires become memory, where the architect's vision transforms into the inheritance of those who come after. The Murdoch dynasty, in all its sprawling complexity, presents us with perhaps one of the most intricate puzzles of modern power. Not who won, but what was won, and what was lost in the winning. Consider for a moment the peculiar nature of legacy. Rupert Murdoch built something that was unmistakably his. Every acquisition, every strategic pivot, every decision to embrace new technology or abandon old certainties bore the fingerprints of a singular vision. Yet as he aged, as his children grew and jostled for position within the structures he had created, a question began to settle over the entire enterprise like evening mist over still water. Can an empire of one man's making survive its maker? Perhaps more profoundly, should it? The divisions we witnessed, between Lachlan and James, between the old guard and the next generation, these were not simply family quarrels. They represented something deeper, a collision between the authoritarian model of leadership that had defined the Murdoch way and the emerging realities of succession in the modern age. One man's absolute certainty, built brick by brick over decades, does not naturally translate into collaborative governance. It becomes, instead, a vacuum that heirs must navigate, each interpreting the kingdom in their own image. What strikes us as we reflect on this sprawling history is the curious paradox at its heart. Murdoch's greatest strength, his willingness to trust his own judgment above all others, his refusal to be bound by convention or consensus, this same quality became, perhaps, his greatest vulnerability when it came time to hand the reins to the next generation. You cannot build a dynasty on singular vision and then expect that dynasty to function as a democracy. The contradiction is woven into the very DNA of the enterprise. There is something almost poignant in recognizing this. Here was a man who had shaped the consciousness of nations, who had bent media narratives to his will, who had accumulated not just wealth, but genuine influence over the mechanisms by which billions understood their world. And yet, when it came to the most personal and intimate challenge of all, how to pass on what he had built, even his formidable talents could not guarantee success. His children would remake the empire in their own ways, and in doing so, they would be both honoring his legacy and departing from it, often simultaneously. The truth, perhaps, is that all empires are temporary architectures. They exist in specific moments, shaped by specific conditions, enhanced by specific personalities. The Murdoch Empire was built for an age of broadcasting dominance and print authority, for a world where information moved through gatekeepers, where narrative control was possible through concentrated ownership. That world has not entirely vanished, but it has become increasingly fragmented. Streaming services, social media, digital platforms created by people Murdoch did not control. These have diluted the power that once seemed so absolute. One might wonder, drifting further into these reflections, whether Rupert Murdoch himself understood this. Did he sense that the world was changing faster than even his agile mind could adapt? The aging magnate, still commanding, still making decisions, yet perhaps beginning to glimpse a future in which his influence would be more circumscribed than it had ever been. There is a certain melancholy in that image, not because we should pity him, but because it reminds us of a universal truth. Power, however immense, however hard-won, carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. The divisions within the family, the schisms between factions within the company, the regulatory battles and the public scandals, all of these will eventually fade. What remains is a template, almost a case study in how power flows and pools and eventually disperses. The Murdoch Empire, in its fullest expression, was always going to be temporary. The remarkable thing is not that it eventually fractured, but that it held together as long as it did, sustained by the force of one man's will and acumen. As we think about this now, in the quiet of evening, we might consider what the Murdoch story teaches us about ourselves. In a world increasingly skeptical of concentrated power, increasingly aware of the dangers that can flow from too much control in too few hands, the rise and transformation of the Murdoch Empire serves as both cautionary tale and fascinating historical record. It shows us how one person, gifted with intelligence, ambition, and a willingness to bend rules and expectations, can reshape the landscape of their entire era. It also shows us the limits of that power, the moments where even the most commanding figure must eventually step back and watch others shape the future. The children will have their versions, their visions. Lachlan will pursue his own brand of conservative influence. James will seek his own path, perhaps one more cautious, more concerned with reputation and regulation. Elizabeth and Prudence will forge their own understandings of what this legacy means to them, and none of them will ever be quite like their father, which is simultaneously the point and the promise. An empire that merely replicated its founder would be stagnant, trapped in amber, unable to move forward or adapt. What we see in the Murdoch dynasty, then, is the eternal human drama of succession, played out on a stage of enormous wealth and global influence. The specific details, the newspapers and television networks, the regulatory battles and public scandals, these are the furniture of the story. But underneath it all is something quieter and more universal. The question of how we pass on what we have built, how we honor the past while accepting the demands of the future, how we release our grip on power, knowing that what we have created will be transformed by those who come after. There is a kind of peace in accepting this. Not resignation, but understanding. The Murdoch story will continue, will shift shape, will be written by new hands. The empire that Rupert built will become something else, something more distributed, something less bound to a single personality and vision. And in that very transformation lies its survival. An empire is not truly dead when it changes. It is alive, adapting, evolving as empires must. As our examination of this sprawling narrative comes to its close, perhaps the final reflection is the gentlest one. In the end, all power is temporary, all influence eventually fades, all empires transform. The question is not whether the Murdoch dynasty will endure unchanged. It will not, cannot, and perhaps should not. The question is how it will adapt, how the next generations will write their own chapters in a story that was begun long ago by a man who believed he could reshape the world through the power of information and narrative. In many ways, he did exactly that. And in many ways, the most important chapters are still being written, in an era he cannot fully control, by minds he did not shape, in directions he might not have predicted. And perhaps, in the deepening hours of night, we can find something almost comforting in that thought. All empires end, but what they leave behind, the impact, the influence, the very real effects on how millions understand their world, that does not simply vanish, it transforms, it spreads, it becomes part of the broader human story, no longer the property of any single person or family, but belonging instead to history itself.